Imagine taking a morning walk along a beautiful cliffside beach. The water is sparkling, the breeze blowing through your hair, birds are chirping, and there's just this peacefulness that washes over you. But this is a familiar walk. You know this beach. You live nearby. You've almost memorized its cliffs, its rock formations, and the jetties as the water crashes over them. Because you're so familiar with the way things look, when something's out of place, it catches your eye. On the morning of November 28, 2018, that's exactly what happened. A couple was taking their morning stroll when they spotted something large and out of place in the shallows among the jagged rocks of their local beach. It looked strange, and it made them stop in their tracks. But as they tried to strain their eyes to figure out what it was, the waves would wash over it again and again. They tried to put it in the back of their minds and kept walking. But when they arrived home, they couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious object below their cliffside home. So, the husband took out his binoculars, fixed them on the location of the object, and focused on those rocks. It didn't take long for him to recognize something else familiar to him: the form of a human body. Lifeless, unclothed, and at the mercy of the current in the icy waters of Aia Beach in Greece. Our laws punish those who break them, but it took a long time to get here. Other countries, unfortunately, are far behind. That scares me. Why? Well, because we see all these beautiful pictures of people traveling all over the world. We've all seen them on Instagram, those perfectly posed, tan bodies on the sands of beautiful foreign beaches, or sipping a latte at a cozy international coffee shop with spectacular buildings and gorgeous views in the background. Places like the one we're talking about today, Greece, are highlighted all the time. There's no denying how breathtaking that view really is. Who wouldn't want to visit? Well, after you hear this story, maybe you won't. This isn't meant to be an anti-travel or anti-Greece specific video, but it will definitely open your eyes to a lot of things that the pretty pictures leave out. The ugly side of such a beautiful destination. The human side, or I should say, the inhuman side. Sure, the landscape is, as they say, to die for, but what if you were truly paying with your life by being there? This case, and many others like it, makes me realize how little many Americans, including myself, truly understand how different our countries are, especially in terms of laws, or maybe their laws and the lack thereof. So, to Greece we go, to the white sandy beaches and crystal clear waters of the Aegean Sea. It's a place where you can see ancient ruins right alongside modern cities. But beyond the idyllic scenery, there are deep social issues that usually don't make it onto Instagram feeds. In recent years, Greece has been grappling with the impact of widespread misogyny, which, by the way, is a Greek word that translates to hatred for women. Greece is also dealing with xenophobia, another word of Greek origin that means fear of strangers, or as we know it, prejudice against people from other countries. These are not new issues, but a few recent cases have brought them into the spotlight again. Now, Greece, and other countries around the world, are being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about women and minorities and how they're treated. I'm going to be talking about the brutal murder of a young Greek university student whose whole life was ahead of her. Sadly, her story didn't end with her final breath or even the criminal investigation that followed. Instead, her case exposed the darker side of Greek society, the evil minds of her killers, and the truths that those in power would rather hide than confront. They'd rather blame the victim than admit how deeply their problems go. So I want to take you back to that early November morning in 2018, when the married couple was walking along the cliffside beach and saw the mysterious object below in the shallow water. You know from the beginning of this video that after getting binoculars, the husband realized he was looking at the body of a human being. It was 7:30 a.m. when he rushed to call the authorities, and due to the fact that they were dealing with a deceased victim in a body of water, the Coast Guard, Thomas Zovas, was assigned to this case. This area of the beach was almost like its own little bay, a cove below the rocky cliff, an indent along the coast of the island of Rhodes, or Rhodes, as we would say here in the United States. So that's how I'm going to pronounce it, Rhodes. Surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, this beach itself isn't a touristy area, it's isolated. And what's more is that the spot where the body was located was really hard to reach. It was below a 30-foot drop, so 10 meters down, in a part of the beach where there was no land access. The Coast Guard knew he'd need professional divers to come out and to come quickly, because this was a dire situation. It was just merely by chance that this body hadn't been pulled out to the vast Mediterranean Sea by the current, and at any moment it could become dislodged from the rocks. It was being cradled by 3 of them, and it could disappear forever. Look on this map and see how vast this body of water is. Anything that made it beyond that bay would float away and make its way to the North Atlantic, never to be seen again. So they had to act fast. The waves were strong, and with every crash, the chance of that body slipping under and being pulled away from shore grew greater and greater. I'm blurring this out, but you can make out the light skin in the silhouette of this body. There were 3 boulders stopping it from floating away. Coast Guard official Thomas Zovas could see from his vantage point that it appeared to be the naked body of a woman. Here is a blurred video clip of the waves and how rough they were, crashing around those rocks and the body in between them. Soon, professional divers, Talasinos Manos and Kostas Balafas, came to the location, and immediately they were shocked by the mere fact that the body was still there. Kostas said in a quote in a video later that I have translated since all my research was in Greek. He said, "By coincidence, we had arrived early, and the conditions were such that we were able to find her by chance. If the weather took her out of the embrace of the bay, we would have never found her. The southern wind kept her in the harbor." In cases like this, the divers will always take rope and a floating stretcher with them. When they get to a body, they wrap the rope under both of the arms and across the chest securely, then pull the body onto the stretcher to get it to shore. So that was their initial plan, but they were in a rush, so they couldn't take the stretcher. Their first priority was making sure the body didn't disappear, so they only brought the rope, which they called a makeshift solution. The water was murky and it was rough. They had to swim quite a distance, around 400 feet, to the rocks. Kostas made it to the body first, and Thalasinos threw him the rope. He ended up, unfortunately, having to tie it around the victim's legs, near her ankles, in a hurry, just to make sure they weren't going to lose her. And it was a her. It was clear as they got close. She was unclothed except for a bra. She was face down in the water, her skin very pale, almost blue from how cold it was. Her long dark hair contrasted against the white wave crests. When Kostas got closer, he realized the woman was tall, almost 6 feet tall. He and Thalasinos were worried about how they were going to get her to shore. But first, Kostas turned the woman over. When the men who had seen their fair share of deceased individuals saw this woman's face, they were in shock. They both said they were speechless. It actually physically took their breath away. She was so badly beaten she was unrecognizable. They quickly realized that this was not an accidental fall from a cruise ship or even the cliffs above. She had been murdered. They couldn't spend too much time making any other observations in that moment, because they had to get her to shore, where officers could assist them in transporting her body to the morgue for an autopsy, including identification, since there were no personal effects with the victim in the water. Now, this next part might sound insensitive, but please be aware that the equipment available isn't as advanced as you might have expected. In this situation, there were no helicopters, no stretcher, no jet skis, and no basket to move her to the sandy beach, just 2 men and a rope. And as bad as it might sound, they dragged her through the water by that rope tied to her ankles as they swam to shore. She was being dragged like that through the water and even up to the beach by her legs. But they recovered her body, and that's the most important thing. It was heavily misreported elsewhere that the victim was found with her ankles tied together, and that is incorrect. I also have a photograph of the victim floating in the water before she was recovered, and her legs are not tied together. But to make my point, here's a photo for reference. This comes up again when the Coast Guard and officials take photos of her on shore. Remember that she's already tied by her ankles when she's pulled onto the beach. This is where I think the misconception started. Someone saw the photos I'm about to show you next and concluded that her legs had been tied by whoever killed her. But as soon as the victim arrived on that sandy beach, officials placed her on a stretcher, at which point they saw a distinguishing feature on the back of her right calf, a tattoo of a rose. Since they wanted to identify her as soon as possible, they took a picture of it, and that's all they had to go on. Her face was so badly beaten, there would have been no way for a loved one or even a friend to tell who she was. After documenting the tattoo, she was covered in a blue tarp and transported up a tall set of stone stairs to a dirt road above the cliff. The Coast Guard Special Operations Team was leading this case, and Officer Zovas was determined to find out what happened to this young girl and who was responsible. So he began contacting locals and tattoo shops, hoping that one of the artists would recognize their own work. Sure enough, one of them did. He had a record of the transaction, which wasn't too long ago, just a few months. He gave the officer the customer's information. Her name was Eleni Tudi, and it didn't take them long to find out she was a 21-year-old fourth-year student at the University of AAN. It was located on the same island of Rhodes, part of the Dodecanese Islands. They made contact with the school on November 30th, and the school informed Officer Zovas that Eleni's parents had called in that same day, inquiring about their daughter. She hadn't made it to class the last few days, and now we know why. Eleni and her family were not locals of Rhodes. They were from a much smaller town in Greece called Vovomoto, a long 14-hour drive away. The officers got in touch with the local police department in her small town and explained that they were looking for the family of Eleni Tudi. That last name was very familiar to the Vovomoto police because Eleni's father, Giannis, was actually the deputy mayor in town. He and his wife, Kula, had already reported Eleni missing that same morning. They had been concerned that they hadn't heard from her in a number of days. The local police reached out to Giannis and Kula that night and asked them a question that confirmed their worst fears. They asked, "Does your daughter have a tattoo on her leg, a black rose?" They knew that she did. Giannis raced to the police station, and they showed him a picture, probably the same one, or similar to the one I showed you, of the back of Eleni's legs as she lay on that stretcher with a rope around her ankles. He knew it was his daughter and that she was no longer alive. This dark moment would become even darker when the truth was completely uncovered. Giannis and his brother took the very next flight they could find, arriving in Rhodes on December 1st to make an in-person identification. It was their beloved daughter, Eleni, and of course, as you can imagine, her loved one's world came crashing down. It was one of their biggest fears since she left for college, from such a small town to a touristy island like Rhodes. But how could this nightmare be real? Eleni Tudi was born on the 15th of January in 1997 in the town called Vovomoto in Greece. Eleni is actually a derivative of the name Helen, named after her grandmother and great-grandmother. She was the first child to her parents who I've already introduced you to, Giannis and Kula. She was her mother's world. And I'm not just saying that to be cliché because it's true. We hear phrases like that all the time to describe the love that a mother has for their child. But I can tell you, I did a lot of research, and this bond was very deep. Kula longed for a child for so many years, and she didn't get pregnant until she was in her 30s, 34 to be exact. She and her husband were, of course, very happy together, but they couldn't wait to have children. Finally, she gave birth to Eleni, and from the moment she found out she was pregnant, she would sing lullabies right to her stomach with Eleni inside. She would play classical music and read her ancient Greek literature, which Kula had been obsessed with since she was a teenager. She had been a student of classic Greek literature herself and hoped to pass that love on to Eleni. Kula was a kindergarten teacher, and Giannis was also a teacher, so they, of course, loved to learn and wanted to enrich their child's life with the arts and the love of family. From the moment Eleni came home from the hospital and was in the arms of her mother's sister, her Aunt Lita, who she would often confuse for her mother when she was a baby, to her very first bath, her whole family took part in welcoming her to their family. Kula would dress baby Eleni in the cutest little outfits, along with headbands and socks with bows on them. She looked like a real-life baby doll, and those outfits continued through her toddler and preschool stages. For special occasions, Kula would put Eleni in dresses with matching coats, tights, and even a necklace. On her second birthday, the family dressed up and lit 2 candles on a cake for Eleni, her proud parents smiling behind her as all 3 of them held hands. One picture of Kula, Eleni, and her grandmother shows baby Eleni putting yellow flowers on top of her head, and it looks like a flower crown. This picture of Kula, Eleni, and her preschool class is adorable and is evidence of how happy and proud Kula was to be a mother, and what a blessing Eleni was. She was into the arts from a young age, playing an angel in her kindergarten play. As she grew, so did her bond with her family. Eleni was a happy, loving child who was always smiling. Kula said they were the happiest people in the world, their little family of 3. They had everything they could have ever wanted, except maybe another child. Soon, they'd get one. Little Eleni was so excited when her mom became pregnant with her little brother, Petro. Eleni was 9 years old when he was born, and she lovingly kissed her mama's belly to show the love she already had for him while her mom was pregnant. On Petro's second birthday, the family of 4 now posed for a picture with his cake. Eleni was smiling at the camera despite her left arm being in a cast, and I'm sure it was from playing a little too hard. She was an active little girl, very free-spirited and full of life. There was 0 crime, 0 in their small town, so she was free to run and play outside with little Petro. But as her parents hoped, as Eleni was growing up, education was, of course, a big part of her life. She loved to learn, always trying to improve her English, German, and Arabic. Yes, 3 languages. Eleni's father traveled to Jordan to teach Arabic and had taken many foreign language courses, so he inspired Eleni to do the same from a young age. But as teachers, Eleni's parents didn't just buy her books in hopes that she would be inspired to learn. Instead, they took her to see the arts in person. They took her on trips to Athens a number of times, too many to count, and to the Athens Polytechnic, to leave flowers in memory of the people who resisted and fought for democracy. They took her to the Acropolis, to a number of different plays at theaters, and to a bunch of museums, including the one in Parthenon. They even visited the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. They did the same with their son Petro, and by the time he was in high school he had gone at least 3 different times. Eleni also had strong values which her parents instilled in her. They taught her to trust people, to love others, not to mock anyone or be a bully, and to see the glass of life as half full instead of half empty. They taught her to respect those around her, especially those who had less. Her mother said she would take a bite of food out of her own mouth and give it to someone else if they didn't have any. Eleni also learned that not everyone would think and act like she did, and it was okay to be different. She learned to respect other people's thoughts and to try to be friends with those who may not align exactly with the way she believed. And I think all of those are very amazing qualities to have. But on the other hand, Eleni was also aware that the world can be an ugly place and that not everyone has the best intentions. Eleni's goal was to bridge the gap, to be the peacemaker. Eventually, this led to her dream of becoming a diplomat, to officially represent her country's interests in other nations, work to build strong relationships, negotiate and promote understanding between different governments overseas. She even traveled to Jordan with her father and worked there free of charge to teach Arabic. She had really big goals, but I'm sure you can imagine that meant she would have to leave the comfort and safety of her small town. Eleni had never been away from her family before. Being close-knit is a huge part of Greek culture, where great importance is placed on traditions, religious celebrations, and community gatherings. Eleni's room still had her dolls and stuffed animals lying on the shelves of her bookcase, and there was just an air of innocence about her, even though she was old enough to be on her own. After Eleni graduated high school, she told her parents she wanted to experience more of what Greece had to offer. They weren't so keen on her plans and tried to convince her otherwise, warning her about the dangers of a big city. But Eleni was determined to live life on her own terms. So in 2015, she packed up all her belongings and moved to the island of Rhodes to attend the University of the Aegean. She was studying in the Department of Mediterranean Studies, which, according to their website, stands out as the only department of its kind in Greece and one of the few in the world. Her studies included the historical relationship between Greece and the Mediterranean area, developments in the European Union, and the international community. The focus was on archaeology, linguistics, and international relations. This was Eleni's first step toward landing her dream job, and she took her studies very seriously. Her parents, of course, wanted to see her succeed, so they agreed to pay for her student housing, located in the city center. Rhodes is absolutely breathtaking. It's known for its beach resorts, ancient ruins, and old medieval streets, among many other things. Just Google the area and you'll see how extraordinary it really is. The water has at least 3 different shades of blue, and the buildings on top of the mountains, with their unique architecture, are stunning. The town is bustling with people, and it was like night and day for someone like Eleni. She had to take a 14-hour road trip just to get there, and then board a boat to reach the island itself. Rhodes has 10 times the population of Eleni's hometown, and that's when it's not peak tourist season. When that time rolls around every summer, the population increases 100-fold. In the city of Vio, where everyone knew and loved her family, Eleni was a stranger just like everybody else. She blended in among the pandemonium of people from all over the world, all tightly squeezed onto this island. It was an exciting time for 18-year-old Eleni. There were so many new opportunities, but the first was to explore. Walking through the streets felt like stepping back in time. The paths were surrounded by ancient walls, cobblestones, and historical sites, along with secret hidden beach coves that only the locals knew about. Eleni took many pictures, showcasing the town that she would call home for the next 4 years. She shared some of those pictures on Facebook, usually not showing her face, but instead her fashionable outfits against the beautiful backdrop of gorgeous architecture or nature. But it wasn't the old town that appealed to Eleni. For her, it was the modern side of the island. Rhodes is filled with vibrant cafes, restaurants, and shops that cater to both locals and tourists. It's one of those picture-perfect places where you can sip on a cocktail overlooking the blue waterfronts while boats sway gently in the marinas and people gather to enjoy Mediterranean cuisine. The nightlife was also a highlight, with bars and clubs offering good music, dancing, and fun well into the night. The drinking age is 18 in Greece, so Eleni could enjoy all that the town had to offer. Rhodes couldn't have been more different from Vio Modo, which is one of the reasons Eleni chose it. She immediately knew she had made the right choice in moving to the island. It had the perfect balance of being laid back but still offering plenty of things to do. It didn't take her long to make new friends either. Together they explored Rhodes. With Eleni's lovable personality, her good moral compass, and her light-hearted, kind nature, she made friends quickly and had a lot of them. It's also easy when you're in college because you meet people close in age and studying the exact same topics. And soon, Eleni was going out all the time with a large group of girlfriends. For the first couple of years, her focus was on spending time with friends and doing well in class. By day, she would go on school trips, dressed up professionally, and attend conferences. But by night, she would unwind, dress to impress, still wearing her black-framed glasses, so sort of retaining a touch of professionalism. The typical college student, just enjoying her time on her own before she gets into her career and has to buckle down and get more serious. By the time she hit 20, she was ready to explore the more romantic side of the city. So Eleni began going on dates. Even though she wasn't necessarily looking to find the one, she was open to love if it came along. She was also focusing on her health, getting in shape, and even trading her bigger, rounder glasses for smaller, more square frames to show off more of her beautiful face. Sometimes she even slipped them on the top of her head for pictures, or didn't wear them at all. She was a beautiful young woman with long, dark brown hair and deep brown eyes. She stood out in a crowd because of her height. She was close to 6 feet tall. In this picture with 2 men from her school, she's almost as tall as the taller one on the left, and it appears that Eleni isn't even standing up straight. She towered over most women, and that alone can be quite striking, like a runway model. She would be noticed when she walked into a room. But now, I sadly have to take you back. So, when her father and uncle are now in Rhodes, speaking with officials from the Port Authority in regard to Eleni's murder, they're trying to come up with a timeline leading up to what happened to her. Her father lets them know they speak to her every day, if not multiple times a day, and she's very close to her mother. They talk constantly. Giannis also explained that they visit Eleni in Rhodes every summer. They pay for all of her expenses, and she gets extra money from her grandparents for getting good grades in school. She had already purchased plane tickets and was supposed to be flying back home on December 11th to visit for the holidays, but now that would not be happening. Giannis lets the officials know that their family is very close, and they didn't see anything peculiar leading up to what happened. The last time Eleni's father and mother spoke to her was the evening of Monday, November 26th. Eleni was calling to check in with her mom, who had recently had surgery on her leg. She was worried about her. She wanted to know how she was healing because the last time they spoke, Kola had told her she was in pain, but she let Eleni know she was okay, there was no need to worry. She said everything would be fine. They had a normal conversation. But then, the next day, on Tuesday, November 27th, Eleni's mom called her, like she usually did, and this time she didn't get a response. As a matter of fact, the phone actually said, "Subscriber unavailable." You know when you sometimes get the message that either a person's out of the coverage zone, or their phone can even be disconnected? This was that robotic voice on the other end, just saying "subscriber unavailable." And Kola thought that was a little bit odd. She wasn't too worried about her 21-year-old daughter at this point. She knew she was very busy. She had a social life, she was in college, and she was expecting her to just call back and say that she was fine. However, when 24 hours went by and they still hadn't heard from her, her mom started to panic. This time, the phone was going straight to voicemail, and Kola was leaving a bunch of messages, one after the other. She's desperately trying to get in touch with her daughter, and she starts to get really scared. That's when she goes to her husband and says, "Giannis, we have to do something. Eleni calls me 10 times a day, and now there's just nothing." They were so far away from her, they really felt like they had no control over this situation, even to find out what happened and why she's not answering. So, they asked one of their friends who lived in Rhodes if he could go over to their daughter's apartment and knock on her door to find out what's going on. He does, and she doesn't answer. That's when he takes it one step further and goes down to the university office. That's when he finds out she hadn't been in class the last couple of days. And that's highly unusual for Eleni. The university was sort of like, "You know what? Don't worry about it. If something bad happened, we would be the first to know. So, if you don't hear anything from us, everything's okay. She'll probably turn back up." But this wasn't good enough for her parents, and they decided to report her to the police department in Rhodes, as well as their local police department in Vivmodo. I've already explained to you that that same night is the night they get the phone call, having to identify her tattoo. But now, officers know she was alive on Monday, the 26th, so it seems like something could have happened to her on the 27th, because she didn't reach out to her family. By this time, crime scene investigators had already been to the area above the cove where Eleni's body was found, and they made some very significant discoveries. Along the cliffside, there were items scattered throughout the rocks and brush, leading over the side of that steep drop. They found things like a sock, a foam pad, and some other things that were out of place. It appeared as though somebody had dumped those items off the side of this cliff, and it became very obvious at this point that Eleni had also been dumped over the side of this cliff, which is about 32 feet high. There was some kind of thin foam pad, like I said, and then there was also what looked like it could be a pillowcase of some kind. Maybe it was even a sheet with pink accents. For a moment, I thought I even saw Eleni's black-framed glasses between the foam pad and that pillowcase, but it was actually my eyes just playing tricks on me. When I zoomed in, it was just seaweed. At this point, They haven't found anything belonging to Eleni, but these items were all collected for analysis. It's December 1st. Eleni's father is still with the Port Authority officers. He has the opportunity to go to his daughter's apartment along with the forensic team, and they actually take photographs. But they haven't conducted any kind of investigation at her apartment before this point. They're just going over to document everything the way it was when they walked in. Now, I do have some of these photos, and I thought they were very interesting, not only to showcase what kind of person Eleni was and what she cared about, but what she was doing before she disappeared and was later found floating in that icy water. It's a small studio apartment in the town center. On one side was a bed, and it was still made. It had a bright orange, yellow, and red bedspread on it. She also had a futon, opened into the position of a couch with some blankets, pillows, and covers on top. She had a tapestry nailed to the wall above her bed. She's also taken pictures in this area that I saw her post on Facebook. On the other side of the room, she had a vanity mirror with a dresser. There are a lot of girly things here: lotions, perfumes, spray bottles, hair products, brushes, clothing, lotion, just the typical items that you would see on a woman's dresser. I also noticed little butterflies stuck to the mirror and the word dream above her bed on the wall. This just shows parts of her personality. She also had some scarves that were draped on her mirror, as well as some necklaces hanging down further from her dresser. There was a desk that contained a tiny desk lamp, her books, her laptop, and the things she would need for college, along with an ashtray and a half-smoked cigarette. There were 2 cookies on a plate and a couple of drinking glasses on the desk as well. It looks like she was just sitting there before she left. Even though the laptop is now closed in this photo, apparently it had been open, which made it seem as though maybe she had been corresponding with someone or doing schoolwork. She had a tiny kitchenette, and from the looks of it, it's tidy, but appears to have a dish and a glass with a spoon inside the sink. If you put this all together, it really looks like she finished dinner, sat down at her laptop, smoked a cigarette, and had a couple of cookies with a drink. It's almost as though it looks like maybe something interrupted her, because she was the type of person to clean up after herself. Everything else is pretty tidy, even though, of course, we know she's a typical college student. She's got a lot of shoes on the floor and some clothes hanging here and there on chairs, but for the most part, everything is pretty organized. What really stood out to her dad, knowing what he knew about his own daughter, was a half-eaten apple still in her mini refrigerator and a half-stick of gum on her counter. This really looked like she was enjoying a regular weeknight in, but something pulled her away. But the biggest indication that she was kind of in the middle of her normal routine before something got in the way was her laundry. She had a small balcony outside of her apartment where she would wash and dry her clothing. She would use this red basin which was sitting outside, and you can still see her clothes hanging there to dry. Her father said that some of the clothes were still inside the wash, so to him, this meant she expected to come right back. If she had willingly gone anywhere, the fact that some of the clothes were hanging to dry and others were still being washed in the bucket meant to him that his daughter's intention was to continue with her chores. So what happened? The hardest part for Eleni's dad was knowing that he was looking at all of his precious daughter's possessions, things that she collected and cherished, clothes that still smelled like her, and the last things she wore or touched. He couldn't bear to leave them behind. He wanted so badly to collect everything and take it with him. He wanted to collect her memories, even her cigarette butt, the apple, the gum, and even strands of hair that were near her sink. He didn't want any more of her to be gone forever, and I was tearing up reading this. As a parent, it is just horrible for anyone to have to go through. Eleni's mother was in disbelief. She was inconsolable. She couldn't accept it and didn't understand why or how this could have happened. We're going to come back to the way the scene looked after the investigation gets underway, and they really start to identify suspicious or interesting things in her apartment. But as of now, they're stumped as to where Eleni went before she was killed. They decided to start talking to friends and people who knew her and were close to her, and that is when one of her friends reveals that they were actually hanging out with Eleni at her apartment the night of Tuesday, November 27th, from about 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. As they were leaving, she got on the phone with another friend. I'm going to call her Nora, just for clarity. Nora and Eleni were very close. They were like best friends, and they were on the phone from about 9:30 p.m. for almost 2 hours until about 11:15 p.m. This was something Nora said was completely normal for them. They would just hang out together via phone, do chores, talk about their day, their plans. Speaking of plans, Nora tells the investigators that while Eleni was on the phone with her, she was talking about a guy she met about a week earlier named Alex. Eleni thought he was really cute. He seemed sweet, and they'd been exchanging Facebook messages with one another. He was going to be in town and kind of, out of the blue, asked Eleni if she wanted to walk through the city center and grab a bite to eat. There were a lot of cute restaurants in this area, and although it was close to midnight, and that seems a bit late, many Greek restaurants stay open pretty late. It's actually customary to eat dinner around 10 p.m. in many regions of Europe, particularly in the southern countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece. It's common for people to dine late in the evening, typically because it's pretty warm throughout the day, which makes cooler evening hours more enjoyable for socializing and enjoying a meal. Eleni mentioned planning to meet Alex at a steakhouse nearby. I looked, and sure enough, many restaurants were open until about 11:45 p.m. Nora says that while she was still on the phone, there was a knock on Eleni's door, and Eleni told Nora that it must be Alex, and they were going to leave to go eat. Then they hung up. But she said that wasn't the last time she was in contact with Eleni. About an hour or so later, at exactly 1:07 a.m., she gets a text that says, "Call me in an hour." Now most women know exactly what a text like this means. It usually means, "Hey, I may or may not be having a good time right now, but I'm going to give myself a way out in case I want to leave early." It was already 1 o'clock in the morning when Nora was getting this text, and unfortunately, she fell asleep. So she never got a chance to call Eleni in an hour, and when she woke up the next morning she realized that Eleni hadn't called her back. She figured that everything must have been wonderful, that she had a great time with Alex, since that was the last person Eleni said she was supposed to be with that night. Well, now at this point, the investigators decide to pull up any kind of CCTV footage from around her apartment that they could find. She does live in a pretty busy area in the center of Rhodes, and luckily, they end up being able to pick up the front section of where her apartment is. As they're scrubbing through the footage, they finally stumble upon a person that looks like Eleni, and she's with a guy. It's a few minutes after midnight. The timestamps on this video are actually incorrect. It was not 2 a.m. It was more like 12:00 a.m., Eleni in a long-sleeve white shirt coming out from her building, and she is with who they presume is this Alex guy. They embrace, and it appears as though he gives her a kiss on the head. Then they're walking side by side until they're out of frame. The investigators backtrack and go further back in the video. They see the guy coming up to where Eleni's apartment is, kind of wandering around, like looking for maybe the correct building. Maybe he's calling her at this point to let her know that he's there, and then she comes out to join him. They look friendly enough, so it makes you wonder, what happened next? Where did they go? And how did Eleni end up dead? From another vantage point, they're able to see vehicles that are coming and going from this area. Since it is late at night, there wasn't as much traffic as usual, so they take note of all the cars and their license plate numbers. As they looked up the owners of each car, they ruled them out one by their aliases, or the fact they did not fit this Alex person's description. They weren't even sure if his name was really Alex at this point. All they knew was that it was the guy she was last seen walking with. That's when they get a hit on a white truck they see leaving that vicinity not too long after Eleni was seen on that footage. It's an older, kind of worn-out mini truck. Now these are not very popular here in the United States, but it's important to know what this truck looks like for context. It's kind of like a truck front, and then it has more of a shallow bed in the back. Not like a pickup truck. It's not deep. This particular truck had a cover on top of the back storage area. The footage is poor, as usual, and they can't make out who was inside the front, but they run the license plate, and it comes up as belonging to a business owned by a well-known Greek family on the island with the last name Kouros. The Kouros family was said to be wealthy, connected, and owned half of Pafos, which is an area of Rhodes. The family owned 3 or 4 health shops, a number of restaurants, including a Chinese restaurant, cafes, and even a small hotel. So, of course, investigators are curious as to why someone driving this business truck would be picking up Eleni, but they had narrowed it down. This had to be the vehicle that she left in. As more CCTV footage is being turned over, one gas station in the direction of the beach, where Eleni's body was eventually found, shows the same white mini truck right outside of Rhodes, heading towards the town of Lindos at 12:35 a.m. So at that point in time, Eleni had been traveling for over 30 minutes with this person who picked her up. Once again, the footage is grainy, and you can't see inside the truck to know for sure that Eleni's even inside, but the likelihood is high. This is the direction of Fo, where the Kouros family has property and family members who live there. As a matter of fact, one of the Kouros family members was the one who used his binoculars to confirm what he saw that morning, that they found Eleni's body on shore. So this starts to look very suspicious. Is this family somehow involved? Why was their truck being used? Why did one of their family members locate the body? Investigators get in touch with the business owner, Mr. Kouros, and it's almost like he was expecting this call because he immediately lets them know that someone was borrowing the company truck that night. A 19-year-old guy named Alexander Luka. Now, Mr. Kouros made sure to point out that this guy was an Albanian. He's an Albanian immigrant, not a Greek, and here is where the xenophobia and blatant discrimination come in. From the beginning of this investigation, there's already a sense that the stranger, someone not from Greece, who doesn't belong there and is not one of them, has killed this young girl. Mr. Kouros provides investigators with Alex's address. He lives in a kind of rundown area in Rhodes, close to the university where Eleni goes to school. With a confirmation of his name, investigators cross-check it against Eleni's Facebook, and sure enough, they are friends on there. I'm sure if you're like me and curious, you might want to know what this Alex guy looked like. Because we heard Eleni liked him, he was cute, he was sweet, but the best description I can give you, especially if you're only listening, is that he was the typical Instagram model type. Light skin, light eyes, light brown hair, toned, muscular, and with a tan physique. He loved to show off, especially his six-pack. He posted a lot of selfies and photos of himself posing to accentuate his body. He was a thirst trap, as they say. It definitely appeared he prioritized working out and partying. Just a typical college-age guy. At first glance, this guy doesn't really seem intimidating or evil. Not by looking at him, you don't really think he could have carried out such a horrific crime. And I realize I haven't even gotten into the details yet of what actually happened to Eleni. So, I think this is a good time to pause this part of the investigation and tell you about her autopsy. Coroner Mr. Panos Krasos, who himself was shocked by what he saw, described what was done to Eleni as extreme, inhumane behavior. He added that there was no trace of humanity in these actions. He revealed that although she had fallen from the rocks and sustained significant injuries from that, Eleni's body showed clear signs of trauma which occurred before she fell. I shouldn't even say fell, but you'll hear what I mean. These injuries included severe bruising and marks around her neck, some indicating that she was manually strangled. There were actually marks from fingertips on her neck. There were also what's called cervical effusion present. This is a buildup of fluid in the spinal cord, specifically in her neck region. This is typical in strangulation cases. She also sustained blunt force trauma to her head and body. She was hit over and over again. The injuries to her head were so severe that her skull had fractured and she had a brain hemorrhage. There were slashes and stab wounds to her neck, and the top of her left ear was cut off. If all that wasn't shocking enough, one of the most shocking aspects of her death was actually the cause. The report revealed that, even though she could have died from her injuries, the stab wounds, head injuries, and brain bleed, Eleni had water in her lungs. This meant that she had been alive when she was thrown off the cliff. In her final moments, she had been paralyzed, unable to move or save herself. In the end, she drowned in the shallow waters, all alone in pain, as each one of those waves crashed over her. The medical examiner also estimated that Eleni's time of death was somewhere between 8 p. on November 27th and 6 a. on November 28th, but we know that she was still alive at midnight on the 28th. So that means, within 6 hours after she left her apartment with Alex, she had been murdered. But at this point, there's no way for them to know how long she would have been sitting in that water, suffering, before she took her final breath. The fact that her body had been in the water for as long as it was made it hard for them to determine if she had been forced into a sex act. But the fact that she was unclothed except for her bra led the medical examiner and the detectives to believe that this entire murder was sexually motivated. 19-year-old Alex was apprehended at his apartment, and he was then detained. They began questioning him about his involvement in Eleni's murder. At first, of course, he said he had nothing to do with it, that he liked Eleni, was excited for their date, and would never hurt her. He has no idea what happened after the time they were together, but admits he did pick her up and they went out to eat. He said, "Look, you can look at her Facebook messages. She wanted to hang out with me. I don't know what happened." And it was true, they had exchanged a number of messages over the course of about a week. In those early messages, Alex talked about his interest and how he spent a lot of time volunteering for various charities on the island, and he also complimented Ellen's appearance. He told her she was beautiful and exotic. In those messages, he came across as an all-round good guy. Eleni was immediately attracted to Alex. He seemed kind, he was charitable, and clearly he took care of himself. His Facebook profile had pictures of him running in marathons, working out, and having fun. Eleni and Alexander kept in touch for the next few days via Messenger. Eleni talked about school and how she wanted to travel in the future, and Alex even said that he wanted to join her. A week after that first message, they agreed to take their connection offline and meet in real life. All in all, it seemed like a typical conversation between two consenting young adults, excited to get to know each other better. But investigators know there's no footage of Eleni coming back to her apartment, so they know that Alex must be lying about not knowing what happened. It takes a while to subpoena things like social media records, phone records, and obtain even more CCTV footage throughout the city to gather more evidence, and at the cliffside, all of which the authorities were already trying to do. They were really hoping that if they came down hard on Alex, he would break, especially when we're talking about a foreigner, an Albanian, over there in Greece. They're not very kind to people who are not from Greece, so they were going to come down hard on him, no matter what. And sure enough, he breaks, but still, he doesn't admit any wrongdoing. Instead, he actually reveals that the real killer was his 21-year-old friend, Manolis Kakaris, that he met at the gym a few months before this. If that name sounds familiar, I've already told you about the Kouris family, the wealthy, powerful, well-known Greek family who practically owned half the island. Yeah, well, this is one of Mr. Kouris's sons. Alex's version of the events that unfolded that night is horrifying. He starts by saying that his intention was to grab some food nearby Eleni's apartment, and then she was just supposed to go back home. But they walked around for a little bit, and by the time they got to the steakhouse, it was closing. That's when he said he suggested to Eleni that she come back to his friend's vacation home, where he was staying, and they could grab some food on the way at a fast food place. They could eat on the rooftop, drink, hang out together, and then maybe even take a walk on the beach. Eleni agreed, and they drove to Manolis's family beach house in Lindos, where Manolis and Alex were staying. Now this account adds up so far with the CCTV footage they have, the footage from the apartment with Alex, and then they also have the footage of her leaving the apartment and then showing back up near a gas station right near Lindos. Alex explained that once they got to Manolis's family beach house, he and Eleni were in the kitchen grabbing drinks. They had vodka and mixers, then they went to the living room to eat. Afterward, he and Eleni were just hanging out on the rooftop. They began kissing, and this is when he claimed Manalis walked up to them and saw them making out. So, Alex decided to take Eleni somewhere more private, into one of the bedrooms where they continued to kiss. Eventually, he said he was lifting Eleni onto the bed and they were starting to get a little more intimate when, all of a sudden, a drunken Manalis stormed into the bedroom, unclothed from the waist down and clearly ready for action. Use your imagination. Or don't. That's when Alex claims that Manalis said to Eleni something to the effect of, "This is my house, he brought you here, and I get to F you." Of course, he used the real F word. Well, Eleni was not okay with this, and she began to try to leave, at which point Manalis stood in her way and said, "If I don't get to F you, then you're not leaving." The words were way worse. It was something like, "If you don't sit on my bleep, then you can't leave." Alex explained that he was very intoxicated and couldn't recall the details perfectly, but Eleni wasn't going to give in. Alex said she tried to get away, and Manalis pushed her onto the bed, then he got on top of her and punched her in the face. Alex was shocked and scared, and at this point, Eleni is disoriented from the strike and she calls out for help. But Alex admitted he didn't intervene at this point. He said that Manalis was so angry that he was scared of him, and he told Eleni something like, "Now you'll see what happens." Since she was resisting, he went into the kitchen, and he came back with a knife and waved it in Eleni's face, all the while trying to take off her clothes and force himself on her. As he continued doing this and threatening her, Eleni was screaming for help. Then, Manalis grabbed her by the neck and slammed her head against one of the walls. Alex said he yelled for him to stop, and that's when Manalis grabbed an electric iron, coming after Eleni again. At that point, Alex said he pushed Manalis, and Manalis swung the iron at Alex, but it grazed him and struck Eleni in the head. Manalis raised the iron again and swung it at her head once more, and that's when she fell to the floor and stopped moving. Manalis told Alex that he took a nitrate supplement when he was working out, and that made him go into a frenzy. I had to look this up. I wasn't sure what it was. It is a strength and energy booster. And remember, Manalis's family owns health shops that would certainly carry a product like this. Alex said that Eleni was bleeding from her nose and her temple, and he was in total shock at what his friend had just done. He then told Manalis not to hurt him, and then he ran and picked up Eleni. He brought her into the bathroom to clean her up, and at this point, she was regaining consciousness. Alex said she asked him to look at her face in the mirror, but he didn't want her to see herself, so he didn't let her. He then placed her in the shower to rinse her off, and afterward, he gave her a sheet to cover herself, because his intention was to take her to the hospital, and he didn't want her to be cold. He took her back to the main living area, and when she saw Manalis, she told him she was going to call the police. Well, this enraged Manalis. Alex said Manalis threatened to hurt him if he didn't help him hold Eleni down. Alex said he wanted to get her to the truck to get her help, but Manalis seemed to agree at that point, and they carried her to the mini truck. They got her into the passenger seat, with Manalis driving and Alex squeezing in next to her. Alex noticed that they were not going in the direction of town, that they weren't going to the hospital, and instead, he said Manalis told him, "Let's just finish this." He drove 7 minutes away and stopped at the top of a cliff. Then, he grabbed Eleni from the truck, tossed her over his shoulder. She was barely conscious. But her last words, according to Alex, were that her father would find them. And that is so heartbreaking. They knew that she was alive when she was thrown off the edge of that cliff. Alex said after Manalis was finished dropping Eleni's body, which he claimed Manalis threw on the ground and then kicked over the edge, he came back and said to Alex, "I got rid of her because she would have put me in jail." He said, "Well, Albanian, it's over. Let's go." Alex said that Manalis threatened to kill him and his family if he didn't help him clean up the evidence. So they drove back to the house and cleaned up. Then they returned to the cliff and threw all the evidence off the side: Eleni's clothing, her purse, and the bloody clothes. Wow. I mean, all of this sounds horrible, but plausible. The investigators were able to obtain security footage from a camera on a house in the area of the beach, and sure enough, it captured the white truck at 2:26, driving in the direction of that cliffside, and it returned to the area of the beach house around 2:42. So this means it only took them 16 minutes to discard her body, a human being that was still alive, and then 45 minutes later, the white truck is seen again on the same footage, and this time they were discarding all of the evidence. Alex even agreed to show the investigators where they dumped all these items. They were then able to collect Eleni's personal belongings. They retrieved her black purse, which you can actually see her wearing in the CCTV footage of her coming out of the apartment. Now it was wet and full of sand. There was the key to her apartment on a key ring, a torn cardigan, women's underwear torn on one side, a woman's shirt, a broken electric iron, Eleni's school identification card, a couple of dirty sponges, a pair of men's underwear, a pair of sports shoes, and a kitchen knife. I've been showing a few of these pictures on the screen. They were found in a different area than where the investigators had found the other items on the cliffside. These items didn't make it into the water because the cliff wasn't just vertical. There were additional ledges, brush, and rocks that kept the items from falling down. But it was dark when these guys were there, so they probably didn't know that. Alex seemed to be cooperative, so now it was Manalis's turn. The investigators wanted to speak with him, and they also wanted to search the vacation home where Alex claimed the attack took place. I want to start there. Alex led investigators to the Chorus Beach House. I'm not sure if they needed search warrants in Greece, because it seems like they just go right into these places. But Alex said the two of them cleaned up. Well, it truly looked like they never cleaned a day in their life, and maybe they hadn't, because this place was a mess, and it was obvious a violent struggle had happened there. They found blood all over the hallway, in the kitchen, on the ceiling, the walls, the staircase, and the bathroom. More blood was found on the tile at the base of the bathtub, on the shower curtain, on the wall, and a lot of the blood was smeared as though they tried to clean it. There were even smears across the kitchen ceiling, and they attempted to remove that as well, unsuccessfully. In the kitchen, you can see cleaning supplies on the counter, a bleach bottle, several washcloths near the sink. On the kitchen table sat 3 yellow coffee cups. One was almost full of a clear liquid, a vodka bottle with maybe 3/4 of vodka still left in it, a pill bottle, a lighter, an energy drink, and a couple of taller coffee mugs, among a bunch of other items. And then, in that same room, there were 2 dirty twin-sized mattresses on the floor in front of a TV. There were no pillows on these mattresses, and hardly any blankets except for one dirty white one and a dirty pillowcase. A pair of sandals sat at the end of the mattress closest to the wall. You may or may not already get a sense that these mattresses were not set up for sleeping. They were strategically placed in front of this TV for a reason that I will get to soon, but you may be able to guess. There were very obvious blood smears in the bathroom, as well as a dirty mop in a bucket next to the toilet. It's almost as though they never thought that anyone would even come in here, because they hardly tried to cover up this crime at all. And it's probably because they thought that Eleni's body would make it out to the sea by the strong current and winds, never to be found. The forensic team collected everything of interest, including 2 sponges, 2 towels, a bag of tobacco, another kitchen knife, which was bent, 2 open condoms, one of which appeared to be more used than the other, and most of all, the base to an iron, which was missing the iron. The iron had already been found at the side of the cliff, so they're putting it all together. And this is pretty obvious. Eleni was harmed here. Now they go to speak to Manolis and get his version of the events that unfolded that night, and it was very different from what Alex said. Of course it was. First of all, the fact that Manolis was Greek and Alex was an immigrant from Albania seemed to be the crux of his reasoning as to why he was, of course, innocent. It was all this terrible, unhinged person from another country, who he claimed he hardly knew and only met 6 months before this at a kickboxing class, that killed Eleni. He claimed he'd only hung out with Alex a few times, a couple of times to get coffee, and a few times with some girls. But Manolis says, I have a girlfriend. Her name is Ornella. We were together for 6 months, and you can check with her. She has only good things to say about me. Manalis said before that he dated another girl named Annabella, who had gone off to England, and he had no trouble getting women. This was, of course, to prove that he wouldn't have tried forcing Eleni into a sex act, claiming, "Why would I need to?" He was rich, good-looking, had a nice body, and a beach house to take girls to. Women were always wanting to be with him, according to him. Instead, he claimed it was Alex. Alex was poor, he couldn't get women. He didn't drive nice cars, he didn't have nice things. Manalis said he just had him around basically to be his assistant, which is what Alex's purpose was, according to Manalis. On the night in question, he claimed he was the one who knew Eleni. He had invited Eleni to come to his beach house, and Alex was merely his designated driver. He instructed him to drive to Eleni's apartment and fetch her, and that he was there. He was in the back of the truck. Now, wait a minute, I've actually read articles that mention this, like he was in the back seat. First of all, no back seat. Okay, no back seat. And then you mean to tell me that this not-so-small dude is inside the shallow bed in back, where there's a cover that is clearly seen completely down in the video clip of the truck leaving Rhodes, and in the other clip of it coming up to Lindos at the gas station. So of course when he's questioned about this, he changes his story and says, "Oh no, wait. I was actually inside the front with Alex and Eleni. I found that to be laughable, but I mean, it could be true, who knows?" Manalis claimed that at first, Eleni was kind of like, why is this other guy here, speaking of Alex? And that's when Manalis explained, "Oh, he's just my driver." But we already know that Eleni never mentioned Manalis to her friend, only Alex. The messages between them really were about them agreeing to meet that night and talking for a week, but Manalis claimed he'd already been dating Eleni for a while. That seems to be a lie right away, it doesn't make sense. But he continued. He said they stopped at a kebab shop on the way to his beach house, and he made Alex get out to go get them, but unfortunately, they weren't open. And that's convenient, because if they found CCTV footage and they saw Alex walk up, then it would look like the story is true. But Manalis's version is that the three of them arrived at 10 p.m. We already know that's incorrect. It was not 10 p.m., it was past 12:30. He said that as soon as they got in, he poured him and Eleni some vodka and that Alex wasn't drinking. Manalis claimed he took Eleni to one of his bedrooms and they had intercourse. When they were finished, he left the room to pour 2 more cups of vodka, and that's when he heard something happening. Eleni was talking to Alex. She said something to insult his manhood, and Manalis said he saw Alex get up and punch her in the face. Manalis said he didn't intervene because, according to him, he was in a panic. He was afraid of Alex. He said Alex punched her in the jaw, and then she fell to the ground and fainted. Then, Alex put her in a headlock, and she went unconscious. That's when he says Alex hit her on the head in a way that could have killed her. He was shocked and frozen in fear, so he did nothing to stop it. Then when Alex grabbed the iron, Manalis said he couldn't watch. He went into another room, not wanting to see what Alex was going to do. He claims he never actually saw him hit her with it, but he heard Eleni screaming for help. But all Manalis could do was sit there and pull out his hair in devastation. That's quite the story, and it's not over yet. He continued, saying that he didn't call for help because he was trembling with fear. Then he saw Alex go to the kitchen and grab a knife with a plastic handle. He said that she was going to pay for this dearly. Manalis said he never stopped Alex because he was too much in shock, but he did see him stab Eleni in the neck. He was telling Alex to stop since she was already unconscious, but instead, Alex yelled to him that he actually needed another knife. I'm assuming since that one had bent. Remember we saw it in the evidence photo. Then, Manalis said that Alex took Eleni to the bathroom, hit her head on the sink and yelled, "I will cut your neck." Then, he threw her in the bathtub, removed all of her clothes, and poured cold water on her. Manalis claimed he kept telling him, "Don't do this," but he just sat there looking at all the blood. It was everywhere, on the walls, left and right, on the ceiling, on the bed. Then, He watched as Alex wrapped Eleni in bed sheets and carried her out of the house. He has no idea where they went, because he stayed behind. He said that his grandmother was staying on the floor below them, and that she would tell them that they were smiling and having a good time with the girl. He never hurt her, it was all Alex. Wow, what would you have believed as an investigator? Regardless, both men are arrested, because according to them, both of them were involved, and until it can be proven which version is true, they had to detain them both. On December 5th, it's announced that the authorities have 2 men in custody for Eleni's murder, and this starts a media storm. There were so many accusations being made, mostly that it couldn't be the Greek boy, it must be the Albanian. That's the whole stranger danger xenophobia part of this case. So many were quick to judge the so-called outsider. The local news was very quick to make it seem like Manolis, the Greek, was an unwilling participant who was influenced by the violent and dangerous foreigner. Manolis's family was also going with this narrative, and they quickly obtained an attorney for their 21-year-old son. Alex was also represented, and both of the men claimed they were not guilty at their arraignment just days later, pinning the crime on one another. They were jailed together at first in the same cell, just waiting for the next part of this case to happen, but they refused to speak to one another. Alex was vocal about how he felt about Manolis telling the media all the things they did. He said, "I don't care what the Greek says, I have a lawyer," which insinuated he was telling the truth and that his lawyer would uncover that in the beginning. When Alex gave the authorities Manolis's name, they actually did go to his house, and whoever answered the door told them, "He's not here, he's working at his father's carpentry shop." So they went there and started speaking with his mother, but she stopped talking to them as soon as Manolis's father arrived. Then, none of them wanted to cooperate, but they did end up putting enough pressure on them to reveal where Manolis was. This family had so much money and influence that Manolis didn't have to play by the same rules that everyone else did. He was used to getting his way, and when he didn't, he would simply throw money at the problem until he did. When they ran a background check on him, they found out that he had previous charges for theft and for physical violence. None of his crimes had resulted in anything more than a fine, which his family were more than happy to pay for to make it disappear. To contradict Manolis's story, Alex claimed that Eleni had no idea who Manolis even was, and that when they arrived at the beach house, all Manolis did was brag about himself to Eleni, talking about how rich he was. That truck she came in didn't even belong to Alex, it was his. He told her about the house his family owned, which included a property that looked over the water and Pefki. But then in turn, to the investigators and the media, Manolis had other things to say, other really messed up statements, including one where he claimed that when Alex tried to stab Eleni, it wasn't working and it wasn't killing her because, and I hate to even repeat this, he said it was because she was too fat. Wow. And she was not fat. Like, why would you even say that about someone who is now deceased? Later that day, after the arrests, a large crowd gathered at FIA Beach, where Eleni's body had been found. They lit candles in her memory, set those candles out on the shore, and said prayers for her and that justice would be done. It was impossible to know which version of these stories was the truth, but the investigators knew that either way, Eleni texted her friend at 1:07, "Amato say, call me in an hour because something felt off." That would have been close to when she arrived at the beach house. So maybe as soon as she realized there were 2 men there that night, she panicked. And there's a reason why. Because something terrible had happened to Eleni just 1 year before her murder. While this investigation was going on, friends of hers were coming forward with some shocking allegations, ones that would cause even more of an uproar in the media and a media circus. It would lead to the biggest protest for women's rights the town had ever seen. Eleni's friends explained that one night, back in November of 2017, Eleni was out at a nightclub with friends when she began talking to a guy, and they were hitting it off. He invited her to come hang out at his place nearby, and she agreed. When she arrived, there were 2 other guys at this apartment. At first, everything was okay. they were drinking together, hanging out. But soon, Eleni began to feel sick. It turned out that someone had slipped something into her drink, and soon she was completely out of it. She could vaguely remember being videotaped while these three men forced her to carry out unspeakable acts on them. She was helpless as they took turns violating her, and she was lucky to make it out alive because of how violently they were treating her. The next day, when she was back at her apartment and finally feeling better, she was mentally broken. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't keep what had happened to herself. So, she confided in her closest friends, and they encouraged her to go to the police and report it. But just before she did, one of the perpetrators messaged her on Facebook and told her that everything was recorded on a video. He threatened that if she went to the authorities, they would release it publicly, and essentially everyone would call her terrible names. No one would ever want to be with her because she was a loose woman. They said it in other words, they were blackmailing her dignity, in exchange for her silence. Which one was she going to choose? Eleni could have stayed silent, but she decided that it wasn't a deal she was willing to make. If she gave those men the power to hold that video over her, she would never be free from them. It was around the same time in Greece that forceful intercourse was finally being recognized as a real crime with consequences. The law still didn't consider whether it was consensual or not. And what I mean by this is that forced intercourse occurred, as far as they were concerned, when someone was coerced by physical violence or a threat of immediate danger. Whether or not they consented didn't matter. Even if they were saying no, it didn't matter. But if they weren't harmed into it, it wasn't considered a crime. The law didn't recognize married men who forced their wives into intercourse either. That wasn't a crime. What was worse was if the unmarried perpetrator agreed to marry their victim, they wouldn't be punished for their crime. You get violated, and then you would even think about marrying the person who did it to you, so they won't get charged with a crime? So backwards. But it was actually a step forward from where Greece was prior to 2017. So Eleni, thinking that she would be helped by the law and the authorities, bravely went to the police department in Rhodes and told them what happened. That must have been so difficult to do. This fact alone gives you insight into the kind of person Eleni was. Even though her attackers might release the video of her, she had a strong sense of what was right and wrong, and she wanted to protect other women. Eleni gave the police the name of the guy she had met that night, and everything she could possibly remember about the two other men, explaining that she was told everything had been recorded, and they were threatening to release the footage. But instead of the police taking action, they told Eleni to let it go. They said it wasn't worth their effort to investigate it since a week had already gone by. That's right, they said a week had passed, so it wasn't worth investigating. Really? So a woman's body can be completely violated, and if just a week goes by, that's too bad? No, I don't think so. It's like they were referring to food that had an expiration date. This is a person's body, it's a person's dignity that was stolen from them, a young person who's coming there for help. And the videotape? Well, when she mentioned it, the cops wanted to see it to believe it. Wow. And they added that if the men had recorded it, then she must have done something to make them think she wanted to have relations with them. In other words, it was Eleni's fault that she had been treated the way she was by these men. Essentially, she was a tease, that she was asking for it by going home with this guy to begin with. The authorities completely dismissed Eleni's report. They didn't even take a statement in the incident book, which is required for any complaint, regardless of whether it leads to an investigation or not. It was as though they were telling Eleni that what happened to her didn't matter, that her pain and her trauma were insignificant and didn't deserve to be acknowledged. It was like it never even happened in the first place. Greece is a profoundly patriarchal society where men hold the majority of the power, dating back to ancient Greece, as far back as the Bronze Age and the dawn of Greek mythology, around 3000 to 1100 BC, with men being at the top of the social hierarchy. Violence against women was normalized as a way to maintain male control. We can see this just by looking at Greek art, most of which I can't even show here on YouTube, but it glamorized and normalized men forcing themselves on women, promoting the patriarchal culture. The patriarchy in Greece imposes gender roles that dictate how women should act, how they should speak, where they should go, and who they should go with. The word itself, patriarchy, comes from the Greek language, which means the rule of the father, and it implies that men make the rules. This is highly ingrained into the minds of the Greek people. And unfortunately, it is a very hard mindset to break. Some may argue that men don't want to change things. Eleni's experience was horrific, and the way the officials responded to her pain was equally appalling. But tragically, this was just the beginning of Eleni's mistreatment. In that moment, she felt like she had to deal with her trauma on her own. She became withdrawn and quiet, and the bright spark that she had, that once defined her, seemed to fade. She felt an overwhelming sense of shame and guilt about what had happened, so much so that she couldn't bring herself to tell her parents. She knew that if she did, it would confirm their worst fears about the dangers of living away from home in a big city, and they would insist that she come back. But Eleni didn't want to leave Rhodes. She wanted to continue her studies and regain control of her life. So, she chose to suffer in silence, keeping her pain hidden from those who loved her the most. Thankfully, Eleni had a very strong and supportive group of friends, and they did their best to be there for her. Slowly, with time, there were signs that she might be finding her way back to herself. She began to go out more, and there was hope that eventually she could heal and move forward. It was in November of 2018, exactly 1 year later, when she finally felt she was ready to move forward and start dating again. What terrible irony that her first date was with the devil. But neither of these men, Alex nor Manolis, looked like monsters. They usually don't. If they did, no woman would be tricked into trusting them. Instead, they looked like the boy next door, presenting themselves as kind, charismatic, good guys. So the fact that this had happened to her meant that if she had noticed that it wasn't just Alex there at that house that night, she would have been on guard right away. As the investigation progressed, it was uncovered that the 3 men who violated Eleni in 2017 were a 19-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a 23-year-old. Their names were never released to the media, but they actually knew Manolis and Alex. Not only that, one of the men was friends with Manolis, and this caused investigators to wonder if Manolis and Alex were aware of what these men had done to Eleni, and if they knew about that video, and possibly even watched it, because this connection did not seem like a coincidence. How did Alex begin messaging Eleni to begin with? The investigators thought it was highly unlikely he just searched aimlessly on Facebook. Instead, it appeared almost planned. If Alexolas knew that these 3 men had been able to force her before, maybe they imagined they could do the same. One of the men actually lived right on the same street that Alex lived on. It wasn't a big area at all, and the apartment she was taken to that night in 2017 was right next to where Alex lived. That is very suspicious. At this point, the media had come out with this story, and women were marching in the streets. They were holding up signs that said things like, "They're killing us," showing that femicide is real and should be recognized. We still have issues here in America with domestic killings and even femicides, where we as women are hunted, violated, and killed just for being women and discarded after being used for men's pleasure. There was so much publicity about this case that many people in power wanted the noise to stop before more information was uncovered. Corruption was rampant. There were people high up trying to get the lead investigator, Officer Zovas, pulled from this case after he was threatened to drop it, but he refused. They thought he was doing too much from their perspective, but luckily this man couldn't be bribed. Then, Greek prosecutor Aristia Donga entered the case. She was determined to get justice for Eleni and her family, and the fact that the prosecutor was a woman made a huge difference. Just one look at what happened on Eleni's own Facebook profile, following the news, shows how backward some people's thinking is about women who are victims of sexual violence. Coincidentally, on November 24th, just days before she was killed, Eleni changed her cover photo to a picture of a storefront with a sign on the door that read, "If you're a racist, sexist, homophobic, or an a-hole, don't come in." Now, who knows why she posted this at the time, but there were some nasty comments from people after she was killed who claimed that she brought this upon herself. One person was calling her an immigrant outsider, even though we know she's from Greece, but, for whatever reason, he claimed she was from Syria. On the picture of her commenting about how much she loved living in Rhodes, this nasty person said it was a journey with no return for her, and then put emojis with laughing faces. While the public came to her rescue, acting like their own detectives trying to track down who this person was hiding behind a Facebook profile, it even made it into the news. One article said that these commenters were saying such nasty things that they were so bad they would make Hitler blush. The first comment says, "Go feed the worms, you filthy scrotum," but clearly it's meant to insult Eleni, who is now deceased, by saying that she's food for the bugs in her grave. Others said, "That's what you get for hanging out with an Albanian." So much victim blaming. Even comments asked why she went out with two guys to begin with, implying she must have wanted them. People came to her defense and even reported the users to the cybercrimes division. This opened up arguments about why the authorities hadn't looked into Alex and Manalis's phones and their Facebook accounts. But by this point, both of the phones were now missing, and they never found Eleni's phone, so it proved to be very challenging. I noticed that even back in 2015, Eleni was skeptical about people, and this was before her attack by those three guys. She wrote a note on her phone and posted it to Facebook. It said, translated, "Count people in the end. At the beginning, everyone seems good." She actually composed that note back on August 22nd of 2015, but posted it to her Facebook on April 13th of 2016. It's basically saying that everyone puts on a front when you first meet them, and you have to wait to see their true colors. It's just sad that Eleni didn't have time to tell who her killer or killers truly were. Investigators were getting a clear picture, though, even though it had been clouded by Manalis's family's influence. It was so strong that they painted him as the victim. His family commissioned articles, news stories, and all kinds of positive PR to present him as the unwilling participant in Eleni's murder. They made him out to be devastated by what happened. In Greece, Albanians are often viewed with deep suspicion and prejudice, and Manalis knew this all too well. Even though he had once called Alexander his best friend, he was more than happy to use his friend's foreign status to get him off the hook. Now that's not to say that Alex didn't deserve the criticism. He was by no means a good guy, but he wasn't a worse guy or a more responsible guy just because he was Albanian. In the media at least, Alex took the full force of the blame, whereas Manalis was portrayed as naive and innocent, the local who got caught up in something terrible. But he was a good guy from a good family, and he should be viewed more positively than Alex, whose mother was just a maid and father just a construction worker. Alex had no college education and only cared about his looks, according to all these articles. But investigators uncovered so much more about Manalis. People were coming forward, gladly, saying they had known him since childhood, and they said he was always a troubled kid. Even as a child in elementary school, his parents, who we know have a lot of money, enrolled him in the best private schools in Rhodes. But at the age of 10, he beat a child in school so badly that instead of him getting in trouble, the management just moved him to a new class. But things only got worse from there. Manalis grabbed a pair of scissors, threatening a child, and eventually cutting off their hair. At that point, the school kicked him out. So his parents tried to enroll him in a second private school on the island, but luckily, the school rejected him because of his background. Over the years, there were many fights between Manolis and other kids, and each time his parents would just conclude it wasn't their child's fault, always making excuses for him and just moving him to a new school. 7 different schools, and every time Manalis's father would claim his son was being targeted because of who he was, almost as though he was saying that the kids were just jealous of him. When he graduated high school but didn't hold down a job, His parents actually let him work at their businesses, but he hardly worked, and yet he still got paid. He would ride around town on tricked-out motorcycles and bully people who he looked down on, always showing off his muscles. His parents allowed him to have the equivalent of $500 every 2 weeks, and this wasn't a new thing. He would show up with a lot of money at his high school, and he would just defiantly flaunt it in front of the teachers and students. It was clear that Manalis believed because he had money, he was better than other people. Back in 2014, Manalis was once again expelled from school because of a fight he got into with another student. He was fighting him with his fist, but also with a nightstick or a baton. This time, the police were called, and one of the professors who witnessed the fight spoke to the media and the police. Well, Manalis's father tracked the professor down. He cursed at him, threatened him, and said that if the professor spoke to anyone about what happened again, he would see what would happen to him. So perhaps violence runs in the family. Then investigators pulled up a case that just happened in June of 2018, only 5 months prior to Eleni's murder. A world champion jiu-jitsu fighter sued Manalis and his family for injuries that he sustained when Manalis was doing tricks on his motorcycle and collided with the professional athlete's vehicle head-on when his bike went into oncoming traffic. The 29-year-old jiu-jitsu fighter could no longer compete because of his injuries, and he took legal action against the reckless 21-year-old. Yikes. So this dude was bad news. But as I mentioned, Alex was too. His facade began to crack as well when a 19-year-old special needs student came forward to the police with her father. This changed the investigators' perspective on Alex and his story. The media actually never released her name, so for clarity, I'm going to call the 19-year-old girl Emma. In reports, she was described as being 67% intellectually affected, and I'm not sure what all that entails, but she did attend a special needs school. Emma told the investigators that who she knew as 19-year-old Alex would come up and hang out in front of her special needs school with other guys, and they would try to talk to the girls there. He was targeting these vulnerable members of society. She said she wasn't friends with any of the guys, but she was acquaintances with them. She would talk to them here and there, and then on December 1st, so just 3 days after Eleni's murder, Emma was approached by Alex and another 24-year-old guy. They convinced her to give them her phone number, and later that evening, they called her and invited her to come take a drive with them and listen to some music together. After agreeing, they picked her up in a vehicle that Alex was driving, and they began driving to a remote area at the tip of Rhodes, where there was an aquarium. By day, there's a beach with a lot of people hanging out, but at night, I would imagine this being very desolate. She said the three of them started walking to where the bathrooms are located, and once they were in a hidden place, they began to force themselves on her, making her have intercourse with them, as well as other indecent acts. She couldn't fight against them, she wasn't strong enough, and Alex even slapped her across the face. But at one point, she began to scream and fight harder, and for a moment they reduced their resistance, and she was able to make her escape. But this poor teen, she faced post-traumatic shock, and she even met with a psychiatrist who reported that the girl's behavior had changed after what these men had done to her. Unfortunately, the girl did not have the courage to report this incident immediately. What prompted her to do so was the fact that Alex's picture showed up in the media in relation to Eleni's murder, and she knew that she had to come forward. After this, arrest warrants were issued against both the 24-year-old man, who was not in custody yet, and charges were added to Alex's record. When confronted with this new evidence, Alex cried, and he said that it was unfair. Instead of taking ownership, he claimed that who we are calling Emma was dating the 24-year-old friend of his, and she mentioned that she was attracted to Alex, so they planned a three-way together, and it was 100% consented to. The investigators wanted to know how he could possibly be turned on enough, merely 3 days after what he claimed to witness Manalis do to Eleni, to want to be involved in this act with Emma, consensually or not. And I thought that was a great question. I mean, wow, if he was truly affected by what he saw, by what Manolis did to Eleni, why would he want to try to engage in something so similar to this? Afterward, he was a predator, that's clear. Alex maintained his innocence, though, saying that he tried to help Eleni and that after what happened to her, he never even went out of his apartment. He said, "I didn't go out at all." Alex claimed that Emma was lying. All she wanted was money. That's why she was making up the story, so that the media would get onto it, and she could sue him for money and get financial gain. He explained that Emma's family was poor and that they probably convinced her to come forward and make up lies. Alex added that he knew what was going on behind the scenes, that he was being discriminated against, and he even said he was afraid for his life. He was already being bullied in jail, and now with this news coming out, he was going to be in for it. And he was right about that. Once Alex was jailed and moved to a different cell than Manolis, he was in serious danger for his own life. Greek police, prison guards, and inmates are known for not being very kind to foreign prisoners. It wasn't looking good for Alex or Manolis. But that wasn't all. Another woman came forward. I'm going to call her Kia. This time she claimed that Alex and Manolis worked as a team to attempt to violate her. This time, it was 1 week before Eleni's murder. Kia said that both men reached out to her on Facebook Messenger at random. First, it was Manolis. They exchanged a few messages and he asked her to meet him in person, but she refused. Later she was contacted by Alex. Now he caught her eye, so they began chatting and soon he suggested coming out to a campsite for a party. At the time, Kia said that Alex didn't appear to be dangerous. She said, "He seemed like an okay person to me." But on the night she was supposed to go with Alex, he explained he was coming with a friend of his but thought his friend would be driving his own car. Either way, it didn't matter because Kia's phone died before she could actually meet up with them. Thankfully, she added that at the time, it didn't seem strange at all that Alex was going to pick her up with a friend. Until a friend of hers saw the news on TV and called her to let her know that the guy she was planning to go on a date with and the one she refused to talk to on Facebook were both arrested. She was shocked. She started thinking about the fact that she could have died that night, so she came forward. It was now clear to investigators that Manolis and Alex had been running a scheme where Alex was the bait. He was the objectively more good-looking of the two men, and Manolis would bribe him with money and nice things to do his bidding. But of course, we find out that Alex began doing the same on his own with other friends of his, probably after knowing it worked a number of times. So now, neither one of their stories made sense. It seemed like they were both involved and purposely pinning it on one another. Knowing everything we know, including how Eleni had already been through everything she had in 2017, I highly doubt if both of these men would have come to pick her up that night in that truck that she would have gotten in, especially in such close quarters. And we know from the video that no one was in the back bed part. So it truly appears like prior to that, Alex used his good looks and his fake charm to convince Eleni to come back with him to the beach house. Whether or not he said that it was his or his friends, who knows? We don't know for sure if she even knew how far she was going to be driven that night, because just after she arrived, she sent her friend that message. That's when she probably realized she and Alex weren't alone. But perhaps at first, she still wanted to give Alex a chance despite what happened to her a year before. I mean, what are the chances that would have happened again? But when you're living in a place like this, maybe those chances are high, and that makes me sad. These men planned this. It's true that this area of the beach was so isolated, only locals would have known where it was, so that would indicate that Manolis was the one who threw Eleni from the cliff. However, the medical examiner mentioned that Eleni, almost 6 foot tall and 154 pounds, plus in a semi-conscious state, would not have been easy to move. They had to bring her down a flight of stairs into this truck, off of a cliff, and that it was not going to be easy for just one person. In his expert opinion, he believed that the two men needed to carry her. Soon after this news came out, Alex was being taken to a hospital. He had been attacked by 7 other inmates. He claimed they came screaming at him for being a killer and the RW, but he kept denying it and saying he didn't do it. But they took off his pants and his underwear, and the gang forced him into intercourse. Yeah, and it was proven to be true by a video of the incident that surfaced online. Definitely not going to be showing that here, but I will show you a still screenshot of one of Bretonig's Alex, cornered on a cot in his cell, clearly at the mercy of shirtless inmates who are kicking him and taking off his clothes as he tried to defend himself. The forensic physician concluded that the wounds he sustained and where they were down below confirmed that he was in fact forced into what he claimed. I don't know what to say about that. One of the inmates that was involved was later questioned about it, and he said that Alex got the minimum of what he deserved. Apparently, they had knives ready to use on him, saying that what he did by not protecting a woman, a Greek woman, and letting her trust him only to be killed at either his hands or even his Greek friend's hands was not acceptable. So they took off his clothes and did what they had to do to humiliate him for doing the same to Eleni. This inmate added that he should have been paraded naked around the entire prison, but he deserved much worse. By the way, in Greece, the media cannot release pictures of the accused's faces, so anytime an article or a video was posted, their faces were always blurred out, but the victims were not. I've seen this before in cases I've worked on internationally, and I honestly think they should show their faces. But I guess innocent until proven guilty. They don't want to mark them in case they're not guilty and then have to live with the fact that they were plastered all over the media. Alex was then transferred to a new prison after this attack. In the weeks after Eleni's murder, Greek police formed a special department for cases of domestic killings. Days after the department was set up, the Citizens Protection Minister made a statement saying, "Violence against women can happen to any family and any woman. Silence is tolerance, and tolerance feeds violence. Victims are not to blame for the silence. We are going to give them their voice back." Feminist activists were not backing down. They were following this case very closely, making sure the investigation was progressing and constantly rallying loudly to put pressure on the authorities to bring Eleni's killers to justice, which is one of the biggest reasons this case didn't end up like so many that came before. And also, it was just by chance that the prosecutor was a woman who actually took the time to look into the evidence critically and was in support of female rights. It was clear that neither of these men's statements added up to the story that the evidence was telling. If either one of them wanted to, they could have stopped what was happening to Eleni. Each of them had a cell phone. They could have called the police or gone for help, or stopped the attack by telling the grandmother that was downstairs. Remember that fact. But they didn't, and that led the prosecutor to believe that they had both attacked her together and thrown her off the cliff together, which meant they were equally culpable for her death. But there is an additional, even more disturbing aspect to this case. The Manalis family didn't stop at blaming Alexander, and when they couldn't defend their son's actions with all the evidence that was coming out, they decided to go with a new tactic, blaming Eleni herself, which highlights the misogyny in Greek culture. This was going to be Manalis's defense. That's right, that Eleni was sleeping around with multiple men, meeting people at random online, and opening herself up to dangerous situations. She hadn't learned her lesson the first time, a year before. Yikes. You would think that this is a bad idea to go with this as your defense, but soon both defendants were doubling down on this perspective, probably hoping that it would get them off the hook for what they had done to Eleni. They changed their stories again. They had to. There was too much evidence that showed not only did at least one of them have intercourse with her, and I'll explain that in a moment, but the electronic evidence was also damning. Once the cell phone data reports came back, the investigators could see that a few hours after they disposed of Eleni off that cliff, 21-year-old Manalis sent a message to a well-known lawyer on the island. It was at 10:11 in the morning, and they talked on the phone. Apparently he was asking them what he should do. 19-year-old Alex also made phone calls to a close friend. They talked at 8:12, 8:45, 11:07, and 11:12. Why do you think he was making so many phone calls? I could guess, But then the next night, at around 9:31 p.m. November 29th, Manalis went online and read the news that someone had found Eleni's body at sea. But just an hour later, at 10:27 p.m., guess what he was doing? He was Googling a song called Mama, I'm a Criminal by a band called Aeon. I looked up the lyrics, and they're exactly what you would probably assume. They're about the singer confessing to their mother that they're a criminal, and how he puts people's names on granite, meaning gravestones. I think Eminem sampled the intro of the song back in 2022 and put out his own version, but Manalis was looking up the Greek version and listening to it. If that's not proof of guilt, there's plenty more where that came from. He was acting like nothing happened. He went further. He began talking to more women on Facebook, trying to get them to meet up with him. When one wasn't interested and responded negatively to him, harassing her over and over again, I might add, he just moved on to 4 other girls on Messenger. There was one girl he was calling and calling, pressuring her to hang out with him. This is literally hours after he just dropped a woman off of a cliff. When she said she didn't want to go, he said, "But I do." Disgusting. There were also a bunch of text messages between Manalis and his friends about going for a walk or working out at the gym. But what was even more telling was that at the time the crime against Eleni occurred, there was evidence on Manalis's device that showed he was searching for adult content, adult movies if you will. He was Googling and looking on YouTube at 2 o'clock in the morning while Eleni was at his beach house. However, there was no communication found between Manalis and Eleni, but the investigators did locate those messages from her and Alex after the murder. Alex went to her profile 2 separate times, and that kind of made me feel sick. I also mentioned proof that at least one of these men had intercourse with her, while a used condom was found at the house which had Eleni's DNA on the outside. But there was no male DNA collected inside due to them not finishing. Now, when you think about Alex's story, his starts to look like it might be closer to what happened. He said he was on the bed with Eleni, they were doing something, and then Manalis walked in. So keep that in mind among other things. But when the truck was examined, bloodstains were also found on the passenger side, the passenger door, the left tire, and some was smeared like it had been wiped. When tested, both Eleni's and Manalis's DNA were found in the passenger seat of the truck. Alex's DNA was found on the mop in the home. Manalis's DNA was also found in samples from the bathroom, as well as the trunk lid in the back of the truck. Fingerprints of both perpetrators were found on the vodka bottle, on glasses and mugs, and a box of oranges inside the kitchen. One of Eleni's fingerprints was found on a box of chocolates. So now their story turns into, okay, we admit we both hooked up with her, but it was her idea, adding that she liked it rough and that she wasn't mentally stable. So not only did they murder Eleni in real life, but they were trying to destroy her reputation after her death. And it's completely legal for the defense team to take this position, and it's certainly not the first or the last time this strategy has been used in a Greek court. Many cases like Eleni's never even make it to trial, and most perpetrators of this kind of violence are never even charged with a crime. And if you need any more evidence about the attitudes of Greek men towards women, wait until you hear this. Manalis's defense team petitioned the court to allow an all-male jury because he said women couldn't be trusted to be impartial. The fact that that's even a possibility in their minds, and even in a court, clearly demonstrates how women in Greece are viewed. But of course, that request was denied. The murder trial began in May of 2020, in the middle of COVID, and both Alexander and Manolis pleaded not guilty. This trial went on for 5 months. There were delays because of what was happening in the world, but it had been nearly 2 years. 2 years of heartache and pain for everyone who loved Eleni. Her parents had to lay her to rest, to say goodbye to their beloved daughter. Their only daughter who could never be replaced. Eleni's father said that when they had to transport her coffin by plane from Rhodes back to their hometown, he kept thinking the captain should go higher so that her body may meet her soul and come back to life. And that made me sad. The funeral procession went all throughout the streets of Vivmoto. All the townspeople and friends of Eleni and her family followed the Mercedes-Benz hearse as it made its way to the funeral parlor. Eleni's parents sobbed as they carried the line at the back of the hearse. It was gut-wrenching to see their sadness. Everyone was dressed in black, with umbrellas shielding them from the light rain, as they showed their support and honored the memory of the 21-year-old girl gone too soon. But after Eleni was finally home and at her final resting place inside her white coffin, in a beautiful grave in a cemetery, her parents were not standing by idly. They were constantly in the media. Eleni's parents never stopped giving their opinions about the killers and what they had done, and the ripple effects it had. Her mother said, "I feel the loss. I understand that I will never see her again, and that hurts a lot. A daily pain, unbearable and tyrannical. I can't handle it. I accept that I lost my child in this heinous, barbaric way." And she said that she replayed the night her daughter was killed in her mind, retracing the path the truck drove and reconstructing the crime in her mind from the evidence. She said, "I identify with her pain, with her screams. I have a lot of unanswered questions, because for 3.5 hours, they could have saved her and they did nothing." She went on to say that they didn't take into account that Eleni has parents. They weren't just killing her, they were killing everyone who loved her, adding, "My life is ruined. I have no more life. I'm a living but dead person. I just live with memories in my house and with candles to remember my daughter." Eleni's father said there was rarely a night since Eleni was murdered that they could sleep. He thinks about the horror his daughter went through, her torment, and it torments him every night. Images of her final moments replay in his head. Sometimes it makes him wonder if they raised her to be too kind, and that hurt my heart. But on the other hand, he made the point that it's not as though you can pinpoint who in your child's life is evil or bad just by looking at them. He said you can't say, "Look at that person you're with. They might be a murderer," because there are people all around us wearing disguises, acting like well-intentioned people, but underneath, they're dark with cruel intentions. Instead of wondering if they raised Eleni wrong for being too loving and giving everyone a chance, they turned their anger on the parents of the monsters who took her life. Yes, and you may not agree with this, but remember this family is going through so much pain. But Yannis pointed out that these men murdered a woman who did nothing to them. But Manolis, he had so many chances to do the right thing in his life. Growing up, he chose a bad path, and his parents swept his issues under the rug. Yannis made the point that Manolis's parents knew he was violent. They knew, yet they didn't take him to get help from a specialist. Instead, they continued to enable him. I think the best point that Yannis made was that being a father or a mother isn't about creating the child in the womb. It's about what you do during their life, how you guide them, what you teach them. It's not just that you're a mother or just a father because you got someone pregnant or you gave birth to a child. It's a difficult role that requires hard work to shape them into a loving person. It's not about throwing money at them and hoping they'll figure it out, or at least get out of their parents' home and not be their burden anymore, like what they did with Manolis. All this is very deep, and I felt really sad for this family. Eleni's mother's Facebook posts about her pain and the way she described it so vividly, I can't fully understand it, but I can empathize with the loss that she felt. There's nothing she could have done to save her daughter. And then, so many secrets were uncovered as they awaited trial. So many women came forward with stories about Manolis and about other men like him, and there was proof of a tragic trend in Rhodes. During the summer, these men target tourists to force them into terrible acts, and when the winter rolls around, they target students and lure them back to places like the beach house. They force them to watch graphic adult content and then act out the same things on them. I told you those mattresses weren't meant for sleeping. They were set in front of that TV, where Manolis and Alex would play violent sexual videos while their victims awaited their fate. Whether it was to get the guys in the mood, scare the women, or a combination of both, it was just pure support for their sick desires. The investigators even found a private secret Facebook group that was really popular with men on the island, where they would post nude photos and videos of girls they had been intimate with, sharing these with other people. The interrogation in this case alone went on for over a year, and then during that over 5-month trial, both men put their true natures on display. They smiled at one another, laughed during the proceedings, and even taunted the media waiting outside the courtroom. They were photographed on more than one occasion, flipping the finger to the camera as they walked between the courthouse and the prison. Well, Eleni's mother made sure to let everyone know how they made her feel. Many times people had to hold her back when she saw those monsters. She would scream at them things like, "Killers! You've ruined our lives and my child's life, and I have to look at you." Inside the courtroom, having to breathe the same air as these men who were responsible for taking Eleni's last breath, her mother would scream at them. One time she said, "I will kill you with my own hands, you murderers. I will take your life." Of course, her husband had to restrain her, and many times she had to be led out of the courtroom to calm down. The perpetrators' families weren't silent either. Alex's father said to the media, "Condolences to the family. I say it and I mean it. I'm also a father and I'm in the same pain." He said that he didn't raise a monster. "I do understand that he's essentially losing a son while he's behind bars, but it's not the same." Manolis's family was not silent either. His mom told reporters that he called her crying, saying, "Mom, I couldn't kill that girl. I was trying to close my ears so I wouldn't hear her scream." Then, Manolis's mom talked about how her family was going through such a difficult time and that she would stand next to her child. She said she could also feel the pain of Eleni's mother. She went on to say that words don't matter, only the truth matters, and hopefully it would come out in trial. She said she wished none of them were in this position, and I don't really know what to say about that because your son created this whole situation. One thing that's different in Greece compared to the United States is that in Greece, an attorney can actually request a cross-examination of the defendant in court. Whereas here, it's the defendant's choice to testify and then be cross-examined. But in Greece, if the judge grants the prosecution's request, the defendants must answer questions that directly challenge their version of events and try to establish inconsistencies with any of the evidence presented. I found that to be very interesting. In this case, the judge did grant the request, and both defendants were subjected to intense questioning. Even their defense attorney said that they sometimes confessed their actions, sometimes denied them, and in general, they had contradictory positions about what exactly happened. By this time, Manolis had changed his version of the story to say that Eleni agreed to have relations with both of the men at the same time. He claimed that afterward, the reason why Alex hit her with the iron and started to beat her was because she told him that Manolis was better in bed. Manolis never admitted to any part of the crime. He claimed he didn't help Eleni because, according to him, Alex threatened to hurt him, and since he was a martial arts champion, he was scared. Alex stuck to his same exact story, saying that Eleni was there to be with him, and that Manolis tried to force himself on her, and when she refused, Manolis beat her. Another change in the story that I forgot to mention. Remember when Manolis said, "Oh, Alex just left, I have no idea what happened." Well, the investigators lied to him, saying they had video and they knew he was lying. He confessed that he was actually at the cliffside, but he said that, of course, Alex threw her over the cliff. Anytime either one of these guys was talking about what happened, it was like they were talking about an ordinary part of their day. It was like they didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Neither one apologized. Also uncovered were prints from Alex's left palm on the ironing board. Now this became a big deal, but I'm going to say I don't think it's that big of a deal. So what they were saying, we know that an iron is usually near an ironing board, but what the defense was saying was that now we know it had to be Alex who used the iron because he grabbed it with his right hand while holding the ironing board down with his left. Of course, we can take that as being the truth, but we don't know if he grabbed it from Manolis. We don't know if he used the iron on a different occasion since he had been staying there. That doesn't prove he was the one who struck her with it. But Manolis's defense attorney was definitely running with that theory, even though it was Manolis who had been violent in his past, and even presently in prison. He would scream at prison officers and tell them that if he saw them on the outside, he would F them up. He was so cruel and threatening to one of the officers that the officer developed high blood pressure and had to be transferred away from Manolis's unit. I feel like a broken record, but it was also uncovered that the Bola family allegedly tried to delete information from his phone when he was in jail before it was finally confiscated. Although incriminating searches, which I told you about, were deleted from the device, they were still found on the data extraction. Even as Facebook was deleted following the murder, and while in prison, his parents paid a doctor to prescribe him antidepressants to make him appear more calm, and so it would be harder for him to appear as aggressive. The charging documents in the case against both of these men were finally complete, and it stated in summary that both men conspired to force Eleni into relations. Manolis used Alex to lure her to his summer house, where they took turns torturing and forcing themselves on her while strangling and punching her into submission, even threatening her with a knife to get her to submit to even more indecent acts. When she refused, both defendants, who were into martial arts and working out, punched her with force in the face. As a result, she became dizzy and momentarily lost consciousness. Regaining consciousness after a while, Eleni declared to the defendants her intention to report them to the police, thus igniting their anger and at the same time their concern that they would be arrested and face criminal penalties for their behavior. They then decided jointly to get rid of her as she begged for her life and to be taken to the hospital. Instead, they used an iron to beat her until she was semi-conscious. Then they took her to an isolated area that only Manolis would have been familiar with, and both lifted the body in her semi-conscious state and threw it from a height of about 30 feet into the sea. That was what they were charged for. That was the entire charging document. The trial began 2 days before Eleni's birthday, and rallies were held outside the courthouse every day. 11 witnesses testified, including co-guard officer Zovas, the residents who spotted Eleni's body in the water, the friend of Eleni's that I referred to as Nora, who spoke to her last, Manolis's grandmother, who was supposedly in the lower level of the beach house that night, both of the accused and their parents, Alex's sister, the medical examiner, and of course, a few other officers. I'm not going to go over what both defendants said because you already know the story. I'm not going to go over the medical examiner's report either. But when the medical examiner was testifying, he was asked a question at the very end about whether there was proof that Eleni was forced into intercourse. The medical examiner said something pretty intense. He said, regardless of intercourse, there is no consent in death. So, whatever consent there was, there's no way it could have covered what happened next, and that was so true. One of the Coast Guard officers, Mr. Malami, testified that when he was interviewing Manolis at first, he knew Manolis had a sister and he also had a sister, so he said to him, "Imagine this happened to your own sister. Why did you do it?" Manolis replied with, "It was very stupid. God will punish us." Both defendants were also questioned, and there were many outbursts during their testimony. When Manolis said that Eleni consented, her father yelled and asked, "Are you ashamed? What consent are you talking about? You rushed her with a knife to her neck, and if it wasn't Eleni, it would have been another girl." The defendant's stories were the same as I already told you, but when Alex took the stand, he was sobbing uncontrollably, saying, "I didn't kill her. I helped her. I bathed her. She told me to take her to the hospital." I will say that his reactions were more human than Manolis's reactions. He was much more arrogant, but all of this could be an act. When Manolis's father took the stand, he painted him as a boy who had drug problems and was easily influenced by friends. He said he believed his son that Eleni wanted it and that it was consented to, which of course caused an uproar in the courtroom. And Alex's sister took the stand, and she echoed the same in his regard, that there was no way he forced Eleni. But we know he forced other girls, if that's true, the ones who came forward. In her testimony, she painted Alex as the one who was influenced by Manolis. She said their relationship was different from any other of his friends. Her brother treated Manolis like an idol because he had so much money. She also claimed that Alex told her he was so excited to meet Eleni, but when she asked him the next day how their date was, he started crying but wouldn't tell her why. Later, when she learned about the incident from the TV, she asked him again what happened, and he started crying. He apologized to her, and she asked, "Why are you apologizing?" He answered, "Because I betrayed your love, and that if it wasn't under the influence of fear, he would have protected Eleni." He couldn't react in the moment because he was trapped in his fears, and he didn't defend her. As for Mana's grandma, she testified that she was home that night on the first floor in the 3-story townhouse. She was in the bathroom and could hear a car come up, then the voices of her grandson calling to Alex. She also heard the voice of a girl, but she said she heard the laughter, but she did not hear anything else. That night, she just went to sleep, but she wished she would have been listening. When it was Eleni's mother's turn on the stand, she highlighted all that she had lost and how she wanted the maximum punishment for the accused. She said, quote, "For 2 lifetimes they will not see the light of the sun. For me to be justified, I will kill them. If they're not put in prison for life, I will do the work for Eleni. Eleni was the most beautiful thing I had in my life. I was happy when I gave birth to her, and they ruined my life. I want them to be sentenced with the highest penalty. 2 humanoid monsters were found to take my daughter's life." End quote. The defense was brutal. At one point, they claimed Eleni couldn't have been forced into anything because her bra was still on when she was found. Yeah, they were like, what man would leave on a woman's bra if they were forcing her into intercourse? What? But, yeah, that was really one of their arguments. But I do want to point out her other garments were completely ripped. The defense also said that Eleni was playing truth or dare with the men and completing their dares with consent, which included intercourse. But the most powerful moment was when the prosecutor made her closing arguments, but they were 4 hours long. I can't even believe that they were 4 hours long, and it was very moving. Anyway, I'm going to highlight the most important parts of what she said, and this was translated by a journalist online. She began with, "All this time, the truth has been told in 1,000 different ways. The truth will now be heard one final time from my lips." In summation, what is closest to the truth, and the truth that her family needs to hear, is that Eleni was led as an innocent lamb to the slaughter. Let justice prevail. Even if hell breaks loose and the world is shaken to its roots, justice can see quite clearly in the dark when it wants to. From the start of this trial, the defendants resorted to all sorts of procedural tricks to obscure the facts of this case. The 2 men pretended to be angry at one another. No intelligent person believes that there's a rift in the relationship simply because one blames the other. During the trial recess, they laugh. They're in complete alignment. This is a game, one of them blaming the other to create confusion. The natural reaction for one charged with such a crime is not this. 2 people with such crimes, if they were in disagreement, would tear each other to shreds. But here they are simply sticking to a predetermined strategy. In this way, they want to blur their responsibilities. The lawyers are in on this game. They're not trying to fool the judges, they want to fool the jury to create doubt. Alex's first statement is the one that comes closest to the truth. Once the lawyers enter the scene, lies and deceit abound. So that's what she said in the beginning as she opened. Now I'm just going to make a few points that she made. I'm just reading it verbatim as it was translated. The prosecutor, at this point, does something unheard of, especially for women and an officer of the court. She accuses the defense of hiding the truth, and she said these lawyers did their best to hide the truth. She added that the lawyers for the defense were trying to fool the jury right from the start and not to believe anything they said. She also said not to believe the defendants, that they didn't have any remorse, and how Officer Zova solved this case and put all the evidence together. But certain people in power tried to silence him. A certain prominent citizen of the island of Rhodes used all sorts of backhanded methods to stop Officer Zova. She said, "I come from Rhodes. I know a few things. Alexander was the bait. He's not wealthy. Manolis is the rich boy from Rhodes. Alexander is the attractive boy with an angelic face. He was the front man to attract girls and take them to the other, who had money. At that particular moment, Eleni was fragile. She had already been targeted, and they targeted her as an unsuspecting victim. She wanted to make a point that, even though it had been said by various witnesses that Eleni was dating Alex, or wanted to be with him, and went on her own willingly, she said that doesn't matter. Even if you're in a relationship, even if you're married, she said a woman has the right to say no. By the way, a year before this case went to trial in 2019, Greece finally recognized consent as a part of whether an act is forced or not. That was a huge deal, because remember, before it didn't matter unless you were injured. Well, that changed, and now you had to get consent even if you were married. The prosecutor also explained that Eleni had no idea she was going to be going all the way to Lindos that night. That was evident by the way she left her apartment, and I wanted to get back to that really quickly. There was so much that showed she was in the middle of doing her chores, her everyday routine, and she told her friend she was just going to get a bite with Alex. She did not have any plans for anything else, as these defendants claim. You think she would have told her friends like, "Oh, I'm going back to this beach house with a couple guys"? No. The prosecutor brought up another point. She said if Eleni wanted to do something further, if she wanted to hook up with Alex, why wouldn't she just do that in her apartment? She didn't have to go somewhere else to do that. They could have done it in the privacy of her own place, not driven an hour away. The reason she texted her friend, according to the prosecution, is that she gets there and realizes she's in an isolated place with these two guys that she does not know. But then, according to the defendants, they drank a lot. Well, if that was the case, why did they find a bottle that was pretty much to the top? I mean, it was like 3/4 of the way full. And if she was watching adult movies, the prosecutor said, what makes you think she wanted to be part of that, as they claimed? She would have done anything if it meant saving her life. She found herself in the lair of monsters. She was innocent. The prosecutor went on to say that there were 2 knives because there were 2 criminals. They wanted to render her motionless by strangling her, and she fought back for 3 hours. When she doesn't die, that triggers their anger, and they worry that if she survives, she's going to turn them in. So they finish her off. They take her to the bathroom because there's so much blood that won't stop, and every so often she's regaining consciousness. She even asked them to take her to the hospital. This whole house is full of blood, even on the ceiling. They found DNA. Then, they wrapped her in a sheet to hide her body and dragged her down the stairs, one in front of the other. The body was heavy. She was in a semi-conscious state. The stairs were full of blood, and then they threw her in the sea. She ended by saying that Eleni was a girl with dreams and goals, who had incredible strength in a house of terror, and she was a symbol for other girls to be strong. They treated her like she was nothing. When she was done speaking, Eleni's father approached her with flowers and said that they were on behalf of Eleni. The prosecutor was weeping hysterically, and the whole courtroom was clapping at this point. This is not allowed in U.S. courts, so it kind of took me by surprise. I was like, wow, I can't believe they just let people have outbursts and speak back to each other during the course of the trial. But wow, her statement was so powerful, and remember, it was 4 hours. I only gave you a highlight of what she said, but it caused waves because she was a servant of justice, but she was also a woman fighting against things that males have done in violence. She was a hero to many women, but she was actually reported to the Lawyers Association for so-called stepping over her boundaries when she accused the defense of lying and hiding the truth. So, a government deputy actually scolded her in public on social media and requested a disciplinary review. In the end, she maintained her position. S for the 2 monsters. They were found guilty in a unanimous decision by the jury, and this would be a life sentence for both of them. There were no mitigating factors, even though the defense did try to bring some. The judge denied their ability to do so. In Greece, the life sentence is actually a minimum of 10 years. So Alexander was also given 5 extra years because of what he did to that other girl, making his minimum 25 years before being eligible for parole. Since Eleni's tragic death, her family has been actively campaigning for the recognition of femicide as a distinct legal category in Greece. I stumbled upon a now discontinued art exhibition that hoped to shed light on femicide, and Eleni was part of it. This very unique project was called She's Gone, and I've never seen anything like it before. I'm so sad that it wasn't continued. The creators were 2 Israeli artists, Karen Goldstein and A.D. Levy. They would reach out to families of victims to ask for articles of clothing that they once wore proudly. Then, they would hang them up from the ceilings of museums and display them. It was very powerful seeing those clothes that were once worn without their bodies in them any longer. Eleni's parents said that they wanted so badly for Eleni to be featured, but their souls were bleeding when they had to choose which garment to give away. Eleni's mom said they were crying over each piece of her clothing until they decided on which ones. She said, quote, "This process was very difficult. To know that once these clothes covered your child's body and now this child is gone, and that the clothes will be shown in an exhibition about murdered women. We didn't want anything to leave the house, but we had to participate in this effort that is being made. The choice was very difficult because in every garment there is a life story. There were dreams, and now there's a cry of despair, frustration, and anger. There's no tomorrow or hope. We too had all these dreams for our child to do the things she dreamed of. She was deprived of all of her dreams. They took her from my arms in one night." End quote. Eleni's murder was the first case in Greece where femicide was used to describe the motive of the attack. It indicated a turning point in how the country and its citizens responded to gender-based violence. Eleni was the 18th person murdered in Greece in a gender-motivated crime in 2018 alone. Femicide is recognized as a distinct crime in several countries around the world. Places like Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Italy have laws that specifically address the killing of women because of their gender. Every single year since her murder, Eleni's parents go to her graveside on her birthday with a cake and celebrate with her. In 2021, the mayor of Eleni's hometown named a street after her and put up a beautiful monument. Many people gathered around when it went up and spoke kind words about Eleni and her family. Even famous people spoke out, including a Greek rock musician, singer, and songwriter, Fevers Deloris, which translated as Fear of Delusion. He released a song entitled Eleni in 2022 to honor her memory. Of course, it is in Greek, but the lyrics are also available to translate online. He sings, "I'm thinking of Eleni Topaloudi. What if a song would have a purpose to rise in the nets that drowned her, to fall in the sea that threw her?" It's chilling and poetic. Eleni's murder has had millions of ripple effects, and I hope it has more now that I've shared the details with you. I hope we can take away a lot from this case, but I want to end with her mother's words that she shared on Facebook in a post about her precious daughter. She said, "My Eleni, my baby, my little girl, my child, my soul, heart of my soul and my heart, my little one. For 9 months you were inside my body. 9 months. How many thoughts, how many dreams I made for us. They get lost in the expectations. I dreamed of you coming into my life, to see your little face, to embrace your little body in awe, to breathe your breath. And I prayed and promised myself that everything would go well with your arrival. I dreamed that my arms would be filled with a new life. I dreamed of singing you little songs, lulling you, and teaching you different things about life and people. You came and lit up the whole world. I was the luckiest and happiest mom in the world. I sat for hours and hours watching you and my brain recording your every smile, every expression on your face. When sometimes a cough or a fever bothered you, I cried and prayed to the Mother of God that you would overcome it, that I wouldn't get something too, because then what would happen? I dreamed that you would walk, talk, and do everything. I dreamed you would run to me, hug me. I dreamed of you saying your first words and calling me Mom. I would get lost in the magic of that word, my little Eleni. As you grew older, so did my anxiety. The time had come for you to dare and spread your wings, cut yourself off from your parents for a while, go to kindergarten, At first it was difficult, then everything became easy. I wanted to go with you and hold your little hand, getting lost in mine. You grew up and you tried your best. You put a lot of effort into your exams, and we were always by your side in every one of your wishes. You finally found your path in life. But it didn't have a beautiful destination, because some monsters got in the way of your life, and they didn't let you enjoy everything you worked for. Let my child's soul rejoice. I did not dream of superb things. I did not have big and dangerous plans, only achievable goals. I never dreamed of money, lots of wealth, honors, glory, medals, and greatness, only joy and satisfaction and love. This is what I dreamed for you. I dreamed to have children, that they would live to a very old age. My Eleni, that you would have lived your whole life happy. This is what I dreamed of, and they got in your way, those monsters, to satiate their gluttony. Until they go through what you went through, there will not be justice. Let it happen. I'm waiting. We hear it all the time. Don't leave anyone behind. Don't go out alone. Be careful. But sometimes the boredom can lead to throwing caution to the wind and unwinding. With a night out on the town for one gorgeous model, the risk was way greater than she could have ever anticipated. I'll be introducing you to Christina Craft. It was the early morning hours in the summer of 2018 when Christina slowly blinked her eyes open. The morning light was streaming into the room, and her head was pounding. She was struggling to make sense of where she was and how she got there. She fought past the pain and confusion, and she started to assess her surroundings. As she took in the familiar walls in the room, she realized she was in her apartment, right where she was supposed to be. Except something wasn't right. First of all, Christina only had fleeting memories of the night before at a bar that she'd gone to for just a couple of drinks. There was no memory of how she got back home. She knew there could be no way she'd gotten too drunk to remember. Or had she somehow? Maybe she overdid it, blacked out, was so inebriated that she had no memory of how she managed to make it back to her apartment. But thankfully, she was safe. But as soon as Christina got out of bed, there was something else that caught her attention. As she stumbled through her apartment, sifting through her belongings to make sense of this strange morning, she realized that many of her things that had been inside her apartment were missing. Her credit cards, her designer purses, jewelry, all gone. And that's when she realized she had been robbed. This triggered a more chilling thought. Had she been drugged to the point of unconsciousness by someone who intended to violate her space and steal some of her most prized possessions? What else could they have done to her? That was a frightening thought. At that very moment, Christina felt angry and fearful. She was terrified of being all alone in that apartment, which had once seemed to be a safe place where she was protected. There's no doubt that that feeling lingered for days, until she found the courage to go out on the town again. She was determined that this one incident, as scary as it might have been, was not going to break her. Sadly, only 4 days after Christina woke up in this daze, realizing her home had been broken into, she was found dead in that very same apartment. Christina was living in Ardmore, which is a suburb in Philadelphia, a place that's steeped in history. Though it's not too far away from the city center, it has maintained its small-town feel. It still has a vibrant nightlife, but it seems quieter and more sheltered from the big dangers of the city. The allure of being just close enough to the humdrum while still feeling safe and secure is what drew 36-year-old Christina Craft and her fiancé Alexander to Ardmore. Before moving to the sleepy suburb, Christina's life had been anything but quaint and quiet. Christina was born and raised in New Jersey and had always dreamed of a life in front of the camera and flashing lights. While some girls dream of a corner office on Wall Street or a simple life with 2 kids, a loving husband, and a white picket fence, Christina daydreamed about her beautiful face being splashed across the covers of the biggest magazines in the world. And while it is true the entertainment industry has destroyed the dreams and hopes of millions, Christina had what it took to make it big. And she knew it. She was incredibly beautiful. Her light blue eyes and cascades of dark brown hair drew people in. But she was more than that. There was a light behind those eyes that shined so brightly, people couldn't help but notice she had star power. And soon, this charisma would get her dream job, one step closer to the big lights. But let's go back to the beginning, before she really found success as a model. Christina Rose Carlin Craft was born on November 11th, 1981, in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey, to Stuart Craft and Dawn Ann Carlin. She had two younger brothers, Brian and Josh, and one younger sister, Kelsey. Brian was only 2 years younger than Christina, but tragically, their mother passed away in 1990 when Christina was 9 and Brian was only 7. Eventually, Christina's father, Stuart, did go on to remarry a woman named Casey, and they had more children, Josh, who was 10 years younger than Christina, and finally Kelsey, who is 19 years younger than Christina. Kelsey was actually born when Christina was graduating from Linwood High School in New Jersey, and afterward, she landed a job as a waitress on the Jersey Shore at Borgata Casino. Though this was a far cry from where she wanted to be, it wasn't a wasted experience. In mid-2003, $1 million was invested in the Borgata Casino to make it into a luxury resort, hoping it would draw in more tourists and stimulate the economy. Christina was still working there, and on Labor Day that year, she met a man who would go on to become the love of her life. He was a banker named Alec Ciccatelli. It was love at first sight. Christina and Alec just hit it off and jumped headfirst into a relationship that would span the greater part of 14 years. This was not your typical boy meets girl, and they live happily ever after romance. Christina had dreams, and she would stop at nothing to reach them. And luckily, Alec supported her aspirations. Soon enough, Christina's persistence started to pay off. In her late teens, she landed a few modeling jobs with some of the biggest names in the world: Vanity Fair, Maxim, Victoria's Secret. She was doing it. And one of Christina's close friends was Eva. They met on a 3-day photo shoot for Maxim magazine. Eva and Christina were chosen as the winners of a modeling contest which featured girls from around the world. They became instant friends after the event. With the exposure from Christina and Eva's Maxim photo shoot, Christina's modeling career skyrocketed. The photo shoot gained a lot of attention, and Christina's reputation grew as a model. She was becoming a name in the industry. She started to become even more well-known and was getting booked for more high-profile jobs. She was living her dream. She had a loving man, a thriving career. What more could she ask for? Well, there was one thing. A job that Christina desperately wanted, but it had always eluded her. It was the one goal she just couldn't seem to reach. It was the pinnacle of a glamour model's career, a way to show the world that you had finally made it and you were someone to remember. Christina wanted to be featured in Playboy magazine. To be fair, Playboy back then was an iconic brand, and it was special to Christina. Playboy Enterprises' logo depicting the head of a rabbit wearing a tuxedo bow tie is still one of the most recognized trademarks in the world. The logo has been used since the 1950s, and many very successful actresses and models got their start by posing in Playboy magazine. Pamela Anderson, Anna Nicole Smith, Jenny McCarthy, the list goes on. So Christina was determined to follow in their footsteps. The only problem is, being offered an opportunity to pose for Playboy is not something that just happens very often. Sure, they were printing editions frequently, but the chances of getting a spread, let alone the centerfold, which is what women really want, were basically slim to none. And I understand that while some people might think of Playboy as just a salacious organization that promotes sex, it was that very quality that drew people to the organization. We can't forget the pop culture relevance that Playboy had in the early 2000s. Playboy extended beyond just being a crumpled-up magazine you'd find in your strange uncle's garage. It was a full-on operation with its own clubs, colognes, even apparel. And of course, in 2005, a hit reality show was released following the lives and times of Playboy founder Hugh Hefner and his 3 live-in girlfriends. Viewers got a rare glimpse into what it was like in this private and seemingly very glamorous life of the women who were dubbed Playboy Playmates or Bunnies. Viewers saw the Playboy Mansion, the extravagant parties that were held there to cater to the rich and famous. Playboy had a reputation as more than just a company. It was a lifestyle, one that held a certain allure that others might not fully understand. Christina was one of the thousands of women who sent their photos in, praying for the chance to be given the golden ticket into the glitzy world of the Playboy organization. Competition for one of those spots was tough, and Christina would have been competing with countless other gorgeous women, all hoping that Playboy would choose them and propel them into the pages of legend. Despite the odds, that's exactly what happened to Christina. Just like she dreamed of, Playboy noticed that she had something special, that unidentifiable X factor. And in 2009, Christina got the call that she had been chosen as Cybergirl of the Week. Now, the Cybergirl of the Week was a model who was handpicked to appear on Playboy's online subscription platform at the time called the Cyber Club. A brief bio would be written about the woman and posted on the site alongside a boudoir photo shoot. On May 4, 2009, Christina was given that opportunity, and granted, it was merely a stepping stone. It wasn't centerfold status, but Christina was over the moon with gratitude and excitement. Wearing a deep purple lace bra, the straps falling off her shoulders, Christina stared into the camera with her piercing blue eyes. Her full head of luscious brown locks tumbled down her back, and though she was wearing not much else, she's cloaked in confidence, and that adds to her allure. In this photo shoot, Christina looks every bit like a Playboy model that she's always dreamed of becoming. This shoot was a big deal for Christina. It gave her a ticket to the exclusive world of Playboy. Just like that, she was attending all the fancy Playboy parties, rubbing elbows with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. And one of the people that Christina met at these parties was the host and technically her employer himself, Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy. She even posed in a picture with him at one of the events. It's famous, and I totally see the appeal for many, even though I didn't share Christina's exact dreams. And for her, attending these events was more about just the open bar and world-renowned DJs. It was also about getting some time with Hugh Hefner himself. After all, he was the man that would decide who was given that coveted title of Playboy Playmates. While Christina had posed for the online subscription platform and been invited to these parties, she was still considered to be on the lower end of the Playboy hierarchy. Becoming a Playboy Playmate meant that you were given the honor of appearing across the centerfold of the magazine, and only 12 girls a year were given this opportunity. And one girl gets the grand prize of becoming Playmate of the Year. Being a Playmate is about more than just a centerfold, a feature, and a title. It makes you an ambassador for the brand. And if you're really lucky, you might even catch Hef's eye and be chosen to be one of his girlfriends. So, as you can imagine, for someone with these dreams, the competition for the position of Playmate was fierce. And the selection process was more rigorous than it had been for picking the Cybergirl of the Week. Christina had a real shot at becoming a Playmate. Her Cybergirl photo shoot was stunning. She had the looks, she had the personality. There was just one thing standing in her way: her age. And at the time, she was only 26 years old. She's young by most people's standards, but that's considered downright ancient at Playboy. And in trying to stay away from having just blondes featured, they had picked way too many brunettes that year for the magazine. That's actually a thing. So, with all those factors working against her, Christina discovered that she wasn't going to get the gig. And just like that, her time at Playboy reached its end as quickly as it had started. It's so easy to become old news in that industry. The death of a dream might leave anyone feeling lost and uncertain about how to go forward. Christina may have felt cast adrift, trying to find a new direction in her life, but it didn't take her long to find it. She had her sights set on being a model, and one rejection wasn't going to destroy those plans. Playboy was just one dream, but she had many more. So, Christina set off for the modeling mecca, the Big Apple, New York City. Christina had hopes that perhaps there was something bigger and better than Playboy waiting for her in New York. She wanted to find a place where she could reinvent herself. So, she gave it her best shot. Unfortunately, in the excitement of being chosen as one of the lucky Playboy girls of the week, Christina might have overlooked one fact. Not many other brands want to work with a model who once posed nude for Playboy. It's just the harsh reality. And even now, Playboy has not been able to shake its public image of being pretty sleazy. Some might even say cheap. Which means brands and agencies can be reluctant to work with anyone who's been part of that world. As beautiful and vivacious as Christina was, she was not immune to the brutal reality of the modeling world. She put her heart and soul into finding modeling gigs in New York. She attended castings and auditions, and while she did get positive feedback about her looks, it was never enough. She never landed the job she wanted. And eventually, with nothing left for her in New York, Christina decided to move into a high-end apartment with her fiancé that he leased for them just outside of Philadelphia in Ardmore, called The Square. It's in a cute neighborhood, and the building has an on-site gym, spacious rooms, and modern appliances. And it's far from living in New York City, but it's a really comfortable place to be. The town had everything you could need within walking distance, including a few pubs and cafes. And it's not too far from the city. So, Christina was still able to go to castings, if that was her goal. But of course, as a busy banker in New York, Alex felt like he didn't have as much time to be by his beloved fiancé's side as much as he wanted to be, or maybe needed to be. Christina spent her days traveling across the city to go on castings, but at least Alex knew she was safe when she was home at their apartment. It was in a close-knit, more affluent community. But it is still well documented that models, especially glamour models, often find themselves taken advantage of by others, especially men. Men will buy into this fantasy that the model's there for their satisfaction, and they feel a sense of entitlement to be part of that fantasy. Alex thought that Christina would be safe in Ardmore, and that they could build a beautiful life together, away from the grime of the big city. So when Alex left the Ardmore apartment on Tuesday, the 21st of August, in 2018, he might have felt comforted in knowing that Christina was safe, tucked away in their little love nest. In that day, when Alex left the Ardmore apartment to head to New York for an overnight trip, which was common for him, he called Christina. It was later in the evening, and he wanted to talk about her day and wish her good night. But she didn't answer her phone. He wasn't immediately concerned because he thought maybe she was just out at a casting or around town. After all, the new area they were living in, Ardmore, had a great bar and restaurant scene, and while it wasn't quite the same as the New York City nightlife, it would do. He also knew that Christina got quite lonely when he was away, so it wouldn't have surprised him if she'd gone out to socialize, so she wasn't just all by herself in the apartment. But as the night turned into morning, Alex was still not able to get in touch with Christina. He called and called, to no avail. And eventually, morning turned into night again, and a heavy weight settled in his stomach. He felt like something was wrong. His instincts told him so. Guided by that sense of worry, Alex left work, made his way back to the apartment, and he rushed inside to try to look for Christina. But the thing is, he couldn't get in their main front door. He could get into the building. He put his key inside of their doorknob, but it would just turn, and the door wouldn't budge. No matter how much he wiggled the knob and pushed on the door, it remained firmly shut. He thought it must have been deadbolted from the inside. There was no way to get into the apartment. And with Christina still not answering his calls or texts, Alex called the police. It was Wednesday, August 22nd, 2018, a few minutes before 9 p.m. when Lower Merion Township Police Department received that call from Alex. He expressed concern for his fiancée, Christina Craft. He requested a welfare check at their residence. He explained he could not get inside their apartment. When Detective Gavin Gashinsky received the news that a welfare check was requested at an apartment in the affluent suburb of Ardmore, he wasn't too keen on rushing over there, because residents in that neighborhood were notorious for calling the police for the littlest inconvenience. However, when he heard the exact address, he quickly changed his mind. He was familiar with a robbery that the police department had just investigated at the very same apartment just a few days earlier. Now, he had a call from someone who was worried enough to call in for a wellness check. Perhaps the thief had come back. Maybe the robbery escalated into something much more sinister. So, He didn't waste any more time, and Gavin rushed over. When he arrived at the scene, he found a distressed Alex waiting outside. Alex briefly explained what was going on. He let them know that he was unable to get inside of his apartment or get a hold of his fiancée, and he'd come home early from New York on business to check on her. The detective agreed that the situation required action, so they banded together. Using a crowbar, the police rammed their way into the apartment. Something I've always wondered is whether detectives consider what they might find on the other side of a locked door before going in. I wonder if they prepare themselves for a positive outcome or guard themselves in case it's negative, but probably both. But either way, in this instance, opening that door was like opening Pandora's box. From the second they crossed the threshold, they were immersed in a crime scene as gruesome and bloody as they come. Surely, being face to face with death, especially death that had come with such horrendous violence, was something that no one would be able to prepare themselves for. It's not what they wanted to find or what a loved one expects to see. Detectives waded through the chaos of the living room area and made their way to the bedroom. And that is where they found the worst of it. At the center of overturned furniture, clothes just thrown around the room, there were pools of blood and a bed sheet on the floor. Detectives moved towards the sheet, and they already knew what they would find. As they gently lifted the corner, they saw Christina. She was lying on the floor, lifeless, completely still and not moving. And her beautiful face had been beaten beyond recognition. It was a gruesome picture of cuts and bruises. Her hair and head were covered in blood, and rigor mortis had already set in her eyes. Those stunning blue eyes that had once captivated an audience of adoring fans were now dark and glazed over, between two broken eye sockets. Her delicate nose had not been spared in the brutal attack. It had been crushed into her face. It was clear from the extent of Christina's wounds that whoever did this had been driven by an intense rage. But who? Why would anyone want to hurt Christina and want her dead? This fun, vivacious girl with a soul that was perhaps the most beautiful thing about her was dead. In cases like these, the number one suspect, and this is almost always the significant other of the victim, that meant the police had a potential suspect waiting at the door of the apartment. When detectives made their way back to Alex and let him know what they found, he was anxiously pacing the hallway. And when he got the news that Christina was dead, he doubled over in shock. He was desperate for answers. But perhaps this was all a performance after all. If you are a true crime consumer, or a web sleuth, if you will, then you'll know that guilty spouses can put on some award-winning performances when they want to, or at least they think they are sometimes. Cue Chris Watts on his front porch performance, for example. Perhaps Alex was better than most at feigning heartache. So naturally, given all the circumstances, detectives brought him into the station for questioning. After several hours, it was clear that Alex had nothing to do with Christina's murder. He was a really heartbroken fiancé, and this was no act. With their first and most important suspect ruled out, police turned to their second potential perpetrator, the person who was responsible for the robbery of Christina only days prior to the murder. That's right, Christina had been the one that was robbed recently. I told you that detectives and police officers had been at that exact same address. Ardmore is not the type of suburb that anyone has to worry about things like this. They don't happen too frequently. It's a very low crime area. So police figured that incident was probably a one-off because lightning doesn't usually strike the same place twice. Right? Well, they're not sure. Now recall, that is exactly what made the detective change his mind about wanting to rush to the scene. This address was familiar. He had just taken a report a few days ago. I explained in the beginning of this video that Christina woke up one morning, on Sunday, the 18th, feeling as though she had been drugged. She was completely dazed, and once she adjusted to where she was, she realized that her precious belongings were gone from her apartment. So, she filed a police report. At the time of her murder, the police were still investigating the robbery and had combed through security footage, which they thought could lead to their thief. Statistics that said 70% of individuals between the ages of 18 and 24 years old have reported having their drink spiked, or have witnessed someone else's drink being spiked with a substance while out on the town. And 87% of victims do not report this incident to the police. But let's go back to what happened to Christina while taking her police report. They had her retrace her steps from the night of the burglary, and detectives had deduced that she'd taken a rideshare to a bar in Center City, Philadelphia on Friday, August 17th. Christina couldn't tell them what happened next. However, after reviewing security footage, the investigators determined that Christina rode back home with a man who fit the description of the rideshare driver that she used that night when returning to her apartment at 3 a.m. And this was just the Saturday before her murder. He was a black male who appeared to be in his early 30s, with facial hair. He had a slight mustache and a closely trimmed beard. He was driving a burgundy Kia Sorento with Virginia license plates. On the CCTV footage, detectives are able to see a man get out of the vehicle while Christina is seen passed out in the back seat of the car. The driver takes Christina's keys off of her body from the back seat and enters Christina's apartment building in the early morning hours without her, just leaving her behind in the car. The man went up to her apartment alone and spent more than an hour in there before coming back out and leaving the building, carrying a heavy box. Around 4 a.m., the man came back a second time a few minutes later. However, this time he woke up Christina and he is holding her as they enter the building. Then the footage captures a very dazed-looking Christina propped up against him as he leads her to the elevators and into her apartment. He then leaves her on the floor as he's bringing more boxes of what they believe are Christina's items to his car. Afterward, the man leaves but returns to the elevator, and once the elevator doors close, the man exits the building and drives away. Police released the still images from the CCTV footage, hoping that someone would recognize this man who broke into Christina's apartment. When detectives working on Christina's murder case are questioning the officers who took her initial report about the burglary, they remembered her because she was so upset. She told the officers during the robbery report that she felt isolated and unsafe and how badly this incident impacted her. While they were working on finding out who that man is, they gather more information about who their victim is. Based on Christina's online activity, they could see she was very active on social media and had a large online presence. She definitely left behind a digital footprint that spanned at least the last several years or more. So investigators combed the internet and found an article about Christina in the New York Times from back in 2016. It was reported in the news that Christina had gone into a dispute with a Manhattan restaurant manager over the amount of her bar tab while she was out partying one night with a friend at the Smith. This occurred in March of that year. The argument escalated to the point that the police were called because Christina allegedly struck the man in the neck and then kicked him in the groin. When police arrived, Christina explained the manager had pushed her, but the video footage showed that wasn't true and that Christina was very intoxicated. She was arrested and charged with misdemeanor assault. Well, this is interesting to the detectives because they know she was out the night that she came home with this unknown man who appeared to burglarize her apartment. So of course, their interest is piqued. After the detectives brought Christina's 2016 arrest to Alexandra, he explained that they went to court and made a deal with the prosecutor to drop all the charges against Christina if she agreed to stay out of trouble for 6 months. Christina then relocated to Philadelphia the year after the incident. Alex wanted to protect Christina, and he felt like she was safer in Ardmore than she would be in the city. Because if she needed anything while he was working in New York, he could contact his parents, who lived nearby in Philadelphia. But while Christina's life in Ardmore was going okay, she missed the hustle and bustle of the city. Although Christina lived in a beautiful community, she struggled to adjust to the suburban lifestyle. Christina had grown accustomed to the city's convenience and energy, and the quiet suburban lifestyle just couldn't compare. She found there were fewer things to do and fewer people to meet in the suburbs, so adjusting was hard, and even though she lived a distance away, she would frequently still party in the city. Then, of course, the detectives stumbled upon Christina's Playboy debut as a cyber girl. And it didn't take long for the media to latch on to that aspect of this case. Her murder became nationwide news, with an emphasis on her history with Playboy that made for eye-catching headlines. Even though it is true, it's also a small fraction of her life. And we know there was so much more to who she was, but it's still a fact. It was also something she had always been proud of. It's too bad it had to be memorialized for such a morbid reason now. But detectives found Christina's Model Mayhem account as well. That was a popular site back in the day, where models could showcase their work and attempt to connect with brands. Think of it like LinkedIn for modeling. In her About Me section, she wrote that she was 5 feet 9 inches, 125 pounds, with dark brown hair, an olive complexion, and green eyes. She wrote that she was of Russian and German descent with a hint of Swedish, and she was interested in fashion, editorial, print, glamour, advertisements, lingerie, swim commercials, movies, etc. She also mentioned doing runway shows, print work, commercials for jewelry, and evening gowns. In her words, she did a tasteful photo shoot for Playboy that was beyond Hollywood glamour. Maybe she was trying to downplay it at the time, making sure it was known that she at least landed the gig and was recognized by such a big brand, but not really going into the details of what she actually was chosen for. But days before Christina was found lifeless in her bedroom, the investigators were trying to piece together who this unknown man was who robbed her. Some investigators were examining Christina's credit card statements, while others analyzed CCTV footage. While investigating Christina's credit card usage, the investigators noticed that someone had used her cards at convenience stores nearby on the night they were stolen. It was confirmed that the man who used Christina's credit cards was the same one they saw break into her apartment after viewing the store's CCTV footage. Thankfully, the police were able to identify this man, and that was because he had previous arrests. His name was Andre Melton. He had a previous arrest record and was considered dangerous. Knowing that Andre had a violent streak, police quickly obtained a search warrant for his home and an arrest warrant for him for burglary. On the morning of Wednesday, August 22nd, just hours before Christina was found, police had actually gone over to Andre's home to execute that search warrant. Unfortunately, while they did find thousands of dollars worth of items that had been stolen from Christina's apartment, including designer bags, jewelry, keys, and even the title to a BMW, there was no sign of Andre himself. But they knew that Andre knew exactly where Christina lived and how to get into her apartment. Had he gone back to try to get more things? Maybe he was concerned about leaving a witness behind who could identify him. Either way, police needed to find Andre. There was now an added urgency to the robbery investigation because we're talking about murder now. Meanwhile, Christina's autopsy report came back from medical examiner Cale Wardak. It turned out Christina had 22 bones broken in her face with significant bruising, but her cause of death was determined to be from ligature strangulation. Someone had put something around Christina's neck. And of course, the manner of death was ruled a homicide. I cannot imagine someone doing that to someone. She was hit over and over again. It's unbelievable. So now, while hunting down this thief, detectives continue to scour through hours and hours of surveillance footage because they have a violent person that they need to catch. They searched frame by frame of footage until they found something. It was Christina leaving her apartment in the early morning hours on the day she was found dead. Christina left the building alone, but a little while later, around 3 a.m., there she is again. But this time, she's not alone. She's walking arm in arm with an unknown man. The man has the same complexion as Andre. He's a black male around the same age, maybe in his 30s. He's wearing a white do-rag, a leather jacket, and white jeans. But it actually doesn't appear to be Andre. This man and Christina walk into the apartment building a little while after 3 in the morning, around 3:08 a.m. Christina's door opens, and the security system recorded that time. But then no other doors are detected being open on Christina's security system until 5:19 a.m., when the system recorded that the door to the balcony closed. Christina's apartment is considered a first-floor apartment, but if you look closely, The first floor appears to begin on what would normally be considered the second story of the building. The investigators believed the perpetrator could have escaped by jumping over her balcony. It's not that far of a drop. And this is because neither one of them are seen leaving or walking back out the front door. Whatever happened after they entered that apartment building would leave one person dead and the other the subject of a nationwide manhunt. Thankfully, the security footage of Christina and this mysterious man was incredibly detailed. It was of high quality, and in a lot of cases like these, the footage is so grainy and distorted that it fails to fulfill its intended purpose. But not this time. The footage was very clear. Thanks to high-tech CCTV being installed in this newer building, officials had detailed snapshots to send out to the media in hopes that someone somewhere would know something. They also distributed footage of Andre, hoping that someone might be able to pinpoint where he might be hiding out. At this point, police had no way of knowing whether Andre and this other man were somehow connected. Maybe they had conspired to rob Christina again, and things took a turn for the worst. At this point, even more news stations were talking about the Playboy model who had been murdered in her fancy apartment. It's just the type of salacious story that's made for headline gold. So news companies kept running with it while the media circus systematically dehumanized Christina and reduced her to just a Playboy model. It did have one positive effect. It helped the police garner more useful information. On August 23rd, just one day after the murder, a detective working on the case received a phone call. It was Andre Melton himself. It seemed like Andre had seen his picture circulating in connection with a gruesome homicide, and he said he wanted to set the record straight. He told detectives that yes, he robbed Christina on the morning of August 18th, but he had nothing to do with her murder, and he wasn't going to go down for something he didn't do. He wasn't going to hand himself over to police as requested because he didn't want to be charged with her murder. I don't know if Andre genuinely thought the police were just going to take his word for it and stop going after him, but it's actually the opposite of what happened. Officers did not let up on searching for him. They continued to investigate the identity of the other man as well, who had been caught on surveillance. They suspected that Andre could have given Christina's address to a friend and set her up for another robbery. But soon enough, the publicity that this case was getting paid off. Everyone was talking about this horrible murder. And when people talk, even when it's gossip, there's often some truth to be found in between the lines. Police received a tip from Akiwanis. The man was an Uber driver who claimed that he had driven Christina and the man on the CCTV footage back to her apartment that night. The driver said that, when Christina and the man entered his car, neither one of them looked distressed or under duress. To the contrary, in his mind, they looked to him like lovers on a date. They were affectionate and happy. The driver said that Christina actually flagged him down instead of using the app and begged him to please let them inside, even though you're really supposed to use the app so it can keep track of everything. Christina told the driver she needed a ride home because there were people on the street harassing her. She promised to give the driver cash when they returned to her apartment, so he let them into his car in City Center and drove them all the way back to Ardmore, which is about a 40-minute drive. However, when it was time to pay, Christina told the driver she didn't have cash on her. She tried to hand her American Express card over to the driver, but he explained that because she didn't use the app, he did not have a way to receive payment with a card. Eventually, the man she was riding with offered to give the driver $100 if he waited outside the apartment for 15 minutes or so while he went inside to get some money and make sure Christina got in safely. The man even promised that when he came out, he would give the driver $100 as a tip and still give him the rest of the money. It was not a good situation to be in, and the driver knew he could be getting swindled, but he didn't feel like he had much of a choice. So they even exchanged numbers, and then he waited outside of the apartment, and waited, and waited, and waited. And as the minutes went by, this man had still not come back out. So after close to 30 minutes had gone by and the man did not return to the car, after walking Christina inside, The driver eventually cut his losses and drove away. Now, as helpful as the statement was, it still left police without one key piece of information: the identity of the man that Christina was with. Police wouldn't have to wait long before they received another call, though, that would put them one step closer to finding out who this mystery man really was. On October 26th, they received a call from someone who claimed to have been roommates with the man in the photos that were flashed all over the news. Except, when I say roommates, this wasn't your typical roommate situation. The person said they had recently shared a room with this man in a psychiatric facility in Philadelphia, and this was just a few days ago. The mystery man had landed himself in the psychiatric ward after harassing a woman in Philadelphia. He allegedly kicked her while he was in Center City Family Court, and he was sanctioned to a 72-hour psychiatric hold. As the caller recounted everything he knew about this person, he told the detectives about a disturbing conversation they had. The caller said that the man had gleefully told him how he strangled a woman to death, and that there was nothing like squeezing somebody and feeling the last breath leave their body. End quote. He said it was the best feeling in the world. Wow, so clearly whoever this guy was, he needed to be stopped before some other unsuspecting person fell victim to assorted plans. The caller had spent time in this regulated institution with this man, so there had to be a record of his identity, right? It was actually a shock when they discovered that the man had been admitted to the ward under John Doe. No legal name was given, and worse yet, he had already been discharged by the time the police got there. They missed this person, who was heavily suspected as Christina's killer, by just a few days, perhaps even hours. At this point, to detectives, this case might have started to feel like an extended game of cat and mouse. They were just chasing their tails. For days, they had pored over everything they had in this investigation. They were working late hours, just getting enough sleep to keep themselves somewhat functional. And still, they didn't have that vital piece of information. Christina's family was a mess. They were desperate for answers. While they were also trying to paint Christina in a much better light than the media had, her loved ones wanted the public to know that Christina was more than just a Playboy model. Her aunt, Angelique Carlin, said, quote, "She was the sweetest girl, loving, kind, generous, and thoughtful. Those are the things I will miss about her." She also, of course, wanted to know how this happened and why, and it's true, we don't know. Christina and the media will latch on to the bad or the most interesting facts about someone: that they like to party, they pose nude, they like to get into brawls at bars. But if we were to have a magnifying glass put to each of our lives, there is bound to be something we're not proud of that doesn't define an entire person. Her father told the Daily Mail that Christina was, quote, "a happy-go-lucky lady. She loved life, she loved to be around people, and she liked to enjoy herself with people. And that's what I think occurred. I think that someone saw her happiness and took advantage of that." End quote. But at this point, the investigation looked like it was going to stall. However, on the 29th of August, just 1 week after Christina was found, they got their break. This was, ironically, the very same day as Christina's funeral. The 36-year-old was brought back to New Jersey, and her service was held at Fenter Church. Her father, Stuart, greeted mourners outside the church after the service, and Christina's body was carried by pallbearers in a white casket and placed in a hearse adorned with flowers. She was later buried at Laurel Memorial Park in Carver Township, Atlantic County, New Jersey. And like I said, that same day, the police received a call from someone who claimed to be a family member of the man on the CCTV footage. They thought this had to be it. They were finally going to be able to catch their man. Well, yes and no. The family member had the man's name, but the police would have to figure out how to catch him on their own. He was identified as 31-year-old Jonathan Wesley Harris, a person who had a felony record and had been released from prison on robbery and drug charges just 5 weeks before Christina's murder. Now that the police had a name, they knew it was just a matter of time before they found Jonathan, and finally were able to put all the pieces of this puzzle together. With nothing else to go on but some old-school detective work, the investigators started to unravel the mystery of where Jonathan could be. They called friends, acquaintances, family members, anyone who might know anything and be brave enough to come forward. And eventually, police spoke to Jonathan's sister, and it was after speaking to her that they got their answer. She told detectives that Jonathan had left Philadelphia. In fact, he was on a bus headed straight to Pittsburgh. With this information, and no more time to lose, detectives contacted authorities in Pittsburgh and let them know a potential killer was headed to their city. He was violent and dangerous and needed to be apprehended as soon as possible. Using Jonathan Harris's photo and his criminal history, Pittsburgh officers formed a fugitive task force to better understand and prepare themselves for what they were up against. And despite having a significant criminal record, Jonathan Harris was never charged with anything like murder. He was, of course, convicted of things like forcible entry and drug trafficking. Pittsburgh task force members made their way to the bus station to try to intercept him. The authorities had an approximate time for when the bus would arrive. Now they just had to wait. They had surrounded the bus station and blocked all the exits to make sure there was no escape for their suspect. Eventually, they heard the rumble of the bus as it made its way into the station, and authorities watched as the bus slowed to a stop and the doors opened. Out walked the very first passenger. It was not their guy. Following closely behind the first was another, but again, not the man they were looking for. But finally, a man stepped out of the bus, and as soon as the light hit his face, authorities knew that was the person they were searching for. He was the third person to step onto that platform. Police jumped into action and ordered Jonathan to place his hands against the wall. For a brief moment, it looked like he might make a run for it, but in the end, he was arrested and taken into custody. Now, detectives had the who. They were reasonably certain that Jonathan had killed Christina. They had the where, because they finally had Jonathan in custody, but they still needed the why. How did Jonathan and Christina know each other in the first place? They seemed to be having a great night together until they entered her apartment. So, what happened in those few short hours that could possibly end up with Christina dead and Jonathan on the run? When they showed him a picture of Christina and asked how he knew her, he claimed he'd seen Christina while out on the town and decided to strike up a conversation. They discussed how lonely she was in the suburbs and how she missed the party atmosphere that the city offered. The two of them hit it off, and they were both under the influence of drugs and alcohol, according to him. So they decided to head back to Christina's apartment and keep the party going after the bars began to close. Jonathan said he'd been providing Christina with party favors that night in the form of as much cocaine as she wanted, with her allegedly promising to pay him for it once they got to her place. But once inside, Jonathan claimed they drank a couple of bottles of wine, used some more cocaine, and then had consensual sex. However, according to Jonathan, remember, there had been some sort of agreement that Christina would pay for the drugs that she used that night. He said once their rendezvous was over, Christina refused to pay the $1,200 worth of drugs. At first, a verbal argument ensued, where Christina allegedly told Jonathan that it was his decision to give her the drugs, and she wasn't going to pay for it after the fact. She had hidden his cocaine, and he didn't know where it was. But when Jonathan didn't agree to those terms, he said the argument escalated. Christina picked up a wine bottle and smashed it against his head. His ear started bleeding while she kept screaming for him to get out. Now, after this happened, he claimed they did get physical with one another, but he did not kill her. He said he slapped her in the face, and she fell to the floor in the hallway of her apartment, and he left. According to him, when he left her apartment, she was still alive, just very intoxicated. While this story does seem plausible, there are just a few things wrong with it. First, Christina did not have any drugs in her system when she was found. Her toxicology report only found alcohol in her body. Secondly, if he did not kill her, then who had done so on the exact same night they fought? Detectives let Jonathan know they weren't buying his account of the story. They got up from the table and left the room, thinking that maybe if he just had a few minutes to gather his thoughts, he might be inspired to tell them the truth. One can only imagine the overwhelming emotions and thoughts that are flooding through a person's mind in a moment like this. There he was in a cold, dark room, having to deal with the fact that he might spend the rest of his life in a cold, dark room, not too dissimilar to the one he was currently in. He must have known the gig was up. He'd been through this before. It wasn't his first rodeo. He had hidden, run, lied, and it had all been futile because there he was. There was nothing for him to do but tell the truth. Those few minutes alone most certainly stirred something in him. Because when the investigators came back, Jonathan told a story that was a bit closer to what might have actually been the truth. He admitted that he and Christina had a physical altercation over drug money. He claimed they used $1,200 worth of his cocaine, which he expected her to pay for. But she thought, in his mind, she thought having sex with him was enough. He said he slapped her in the face, and she fell to the floor. Then he said he picked her up, walked her into the bedroom, and put her on the bed. At that point, he said he was panicking. She was naked, and he had white pants on. I'm guessing he's saying he did not want to get blood on himself. Then he said she was trying to recover from the blow he delivered to her. When she recovered, she began to scream at the top of her lungs. So what did he do? He punched her in the face and begged her to be quiet. He told her he punched her in the face and begged her to be quiet. He said he told her he didn't want to hurt her. But then, when he punched her, she got quiet and she kind of went unconscious. As she was lying on the bed, he tied her hands up with a pair of pajama pants. He tied her to the bed so she couldn't hit him back. He said at that point, she was acting pretty reasonably, and he told her he was just scared and wanted to leave. He did eventually untie her, but he explained that he thought she was cooperating. She was pretending. She jumped off the bed and tried to run to the front door. So he grabbed her and threw her back on the bed, then started beating her in the face, over and over again, this time hitting her harder with the intention of making her unconscious. She finally did pass out, and then he went looking for his cocaine, which he said he found inside a jewelry box. When asked what Christina was doing at that point, he said she was on the bed, bleeding profusely, and he was now looking for money, but didn't find any. He was panicking because she was breathing funny. His words, she was on the bed, breathing funny. These are all his words. He said he didn't know if he should just burn the house down or what. But he turned her over on her stomach, and blood was coming out of her mouth. And she actually allegedly spoke to him, saying, "I'm fine. I just want to call my father." Jonathan obliged. He went to go get her phone from the living room and handed it over to her. But Christina wasn't calling her dad. She was trying to call for help. She was in fear for her life and managed to punch in one number, the number 9. Jonathan said he panicked when he saw that she was trying to call the police, so he snatched the phone away from her before she could press 11. He took the phone and threw it. And that's when he says, in his panicked state of mind, he began choking her and pushing her on the bed. When he let go of her, he swears he still saw her breathing, but she wasn't fighting anymore. Then he covered her body with a sheet because he didn't want to look at what he had done. Then he stole some of her clothes, presumably to change into them because his were blood-soaked. And then he made his exit. Jonathan was never seen exiting the apartment because he said he took a different route altogether. Christina's apartment was on the 2nd story, and around 5 a.m. the sliding door was open. Jonathan jumped out and ran away, just as investigators had suspected. As brutal as this crime was, Jonathan maintained that it was never his intention to hurt Christina. He said, quote, "I panicked. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I covered her with a blanket because I didn't want to see her like that. I knew she was hurt really bad," end quote. Jonathan also claimed that he was under the influence of some pretty heavy drugs that night, which were responsible for altering his behavior. He admitted to killing Christina, but pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder, saying that this was in no way premeditated. At trial, Jonathan and his attorneys did not deny that he had choked Christina to death. Their entire defense was that Jonathan did not go into that apartment that night with the intention to murder Christina, and thus, a first-degree murder charge was too harsh. They asked a jury to find him guilty of third-degree murder instead, which carried a much lighter prison sentence. And sure, this argument seems to make sense until you think about the fact that, number one, Jonathan bragged about the feeling of choking the life out of someone when he met that roommate at the psychiatric facility. And of course, there's the fact that he could have run away, and he didn't come forward even when the story broke in the news. At any point, he could have told the police what happened, but he chose to try to get away with it. He didn't have to kill Christina at all. He could have left her tied up, or even just fled after he punched her the first time or pushed her. But he went many steps further by beating her and choking her to death. Christina fought for her life until the end. Jonathan could have stopped the attack. There was ample time for him to cool down, come to his senses, and make a different choice. A choice that wouldn't have stolen a young woman's life and left her family in a state of sadness and distress. The jury must have had the same sentiments because they found him guilty of first-degree murder, as well as kidnapping, possession of an instrument of a crime, and strangulation. Reporters watched from the gallery as Jonathan processed this verdict. In the end, when it came time for Jonathan to reveal what he thought about the verdict, he simply said, "Justice was served," end quote. And I think he's right. When it was time for Christina's fiancé to give his victim impact statement, Alex addressed Jonathan, calling him a coward, and said, quote, "You killed a kind, loving, generous, amazing person who is sorely missed by everyone every day. You destroyed the lives of so many people and inflicted needless pain on her family and your family, and for what?" End quote. Alex went on to talk about how Christina's murder has devastated her family. He said the fact that Jonathan lied about Christina doing cocaine, or even wanting to buy drugs from him, and just dragged her name through the mud was hurtful. She had no drugs in her system, Alex said. Christina had never once used cocaine as long as he knew her, and we know that he knew her for over 14 years. Jonathan received an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also received an additional 22.5 to 45 years for other charges. And as for Andre, Christina's burglar, he was eventually caught in December of 2018 and arrested on unrelated charges, but later found guilty of burglary, receiving stolen property, theft by unlawful taking, and criminal trespassing. Christina's family reiterated that she was more than just a model. She was kind, and she had a warmth that drew people to her. She never left her side without telling you she loved you, and she loved animals. She also loved her dad, so much so that in her final moments, he was the one she thought of calling. Stewart's victim impact statement, Christina's dad, he described her as the brightest light that ever lived. And even though her life may have been cut short, that light lives on in the hearts of the countless people who loved her. End quote.